The irradiated wasteland of Baal Secundus stretched endlessly beneath a crimson sky, its surface scarred by millennia of atomic devastation and solar radiation from the system's dying red giant. This desolate moon, orbiting the equally ravaged world of Baal, bore the wounds of ancient conflicts that had reduced once thriving civilizations to dust and mutation. Among the twisted spires of melted glass and the skeletal remains of cities, tribes of mutants eked out a brutal existence, their forms warped by generations of exposure to the relentless radiation that bathed their world. It was into this hellscape that one of the Emperor's scattered sons arrived, cast through the warp by the machinations of the Chaos Gods during their assault on the Emperor's gene laboratories beneath the Himalayan peaks of Terra. The infant Primarch's gestation pod crashed into the radioactive sands of Baal Secundus with tremendous force, creating a crater that would later be revered as a sacred site by the tribes that discovered it. The child that emerged from the damaged capsule was unlike anything the mutant tribes had ever witnessed. Where they bore the grotesque marks of radiation poisoning, tumorous growths, withered limbs, and faces twisted beyond recognition, this infant possessed a beauty that seemed almost divine. His skin remained unmarked by the corruption that plagued all life on Baal Secundus, and most remarkably, from his shoulders sprouted pristine white wings that caught what little pure light managed to penetrate the polluted atmosphere. The tribe that found the crash site belonged to the folk of the pure blood, one of the less mutated groups that still retained much of their human appearance. Their leader, recognizing something extraordinary in the winged child, took him as his own. They named him Sanguinius, meaning of the blood in their ancient tongue, for they believed his pure blood might be the key to their salvation from the curse of mutation that plagued their world. As Sanguinius grew, his superhuman nature became increasingly apparent. The radiation that killed or twisted everything else on Baal Secundus seemed to have no effect on him whatsoever. His physical development far exceeded that of normal humans, and by the age of 3 standard Terran years, he possessed the strength and coordination of a grown man. His wings, initially small and delicate, grew proportionally with his body, their span eventually reaching nearly twice his height when fully extended. The young Primarch's psychic abilities manifested early and powerfully. He could sense the emotions and thoughts of those around him, feeling their pain as acutely as his own joy. This empathic connection to others shaped his character profoundly, instilling in him a deep compassion for the suffering of all living beings. The mutant tribes, who had known only hardship and brutality, found themselves drawn to this radiant figure who seemed to understand their anguish and offer hope for something better. Sanguinius's presence began to transform the folk of the pure blood. Under his influence, they abandoned many of their more savage customs and began to unite with other tribes through diplomacy rather than conquest. His natural charisma and the obvious blessing of his pure genetics made him a figure of worship among many of the mutant clans. Some saw him as a returning god, others as the prophesied savior who would lead them from their cursed existence. The harsh environment of Baal Secundus served as a crucible for the young Primarch's development. The constant threat of radiation storms, the scarcity of resources, and the ever-present danger from the most severely mutated creatures that roamed the wastes all contributed to honing his survival instincts and tactical acumen. He learned to fight with both blade and wing, using his aerial mobility to devastating effect against ground-bound opponents. His combat style was unlike anything seen before, a graceful dance of death that combined superhuman speed, psychic foresight, and the tactical advantage of flight. As he matured, Sanguinius began to unite more of the scattered tribes under his banner. His methods were not those of a conqueror, but of a liberator. He offered protection to the weak, justice to the oppressed, and hope to those who had known only despair. The tribes that joined him were transformed not through force, but through inspiration, their savage ways gradually giving way to a more civilized existence under his guidance. The Primarch's influence extended beyond mere politics and warfare. His presence seemed to have a stabilizing effect on the genetic damage that plagued the population of Baal Secundus. While he could not cure the mutations that already existed, children born in areas under his protection showed markedly fewer deformities than those born elsewhere on the moon. This phenomenon only strengthened the belief among the tribes that Sanguinius was indeed their prophesied savior. The Emperor's arrival on Baal Secundus came during the height of the Great Crusade, as his forces systematically reclaimed the scattered worlds of humanity throughout the galaxy. The Master of Mankind had been searching for his lost sons, following the psychic traces left by their unique genetic signatures across the warp-touched void. The beacon that was Sanguinius's soul shone brightly in the Emperor's perception, a pure light cutting through the psychic miasma that surrounded the Baal system. When the Emperor's fleet entered the system, Sanguinius felt his presence immediately. The psychic connection between father and son transcended physical distance, and the Primarch knew without doubt that his true sire had come to reclaim him. The meeting between the two occurred not in the throne room of some conquered palace, but on the irradiated surface of Baal Secundus itself, where Sanguinius had chosen to make his stand. The Emperor descended from his flagship, accompanied by a small retinue of custodians and senior imperial officials. He wore his most magnificent armor, wrought in gold and bearing the aquila that would become the symbol of his expanding imperium. Yet for all his majesty, it was Sanguinius who commanded attention as he approached across the wasteland, his white wings spread wide, and his perfect features unmarked by the corruption that surrounded them. The recognition between father and son was instantaneous and absolute. The Emperor saw in Sanguinius not only the genetic perfection he had crafted in his laboratories, but also the nobility of spirit and strength of character that had been shaped by the trials of Baal Secundus. Sanguinius, for his part, felt the overwhelming presence of his creator and understood immediately the true scope of the galaxy-spanning crusade that awaited him. The genetic perfection that the Emperor had built into each of his Primarchs was perhaps most evident in Sanguinius. Where other Primarchs bore the marks of their harsh upbringings or showed signs of the psychological trauma inflicted by their separation from their father, Sanguinius remained physically and mentally unblemished. His psychic abilities had developed along the lines the Emperor had intended, granting him not only empathic powers, but also limited precognitive abilities that allowed him to glimpse potential futures. The manifestation of his wings represented something unique among the Primarchs. While each of the Emperor's sons possessed abilities that set them apart from baseline humanity, Sanguinius's wings were the most obvious physical mutation, though mutation was hardly the correct term for what was clearly a designed enhancement. The wings were not merely decorative but fully functional, allowing him true flight rather than simple gliding. Their structure was a marvel of biological engineering, with hollow bones that maintained strength while reducing weight, and feathers that could withstand the rigors of combat while maintaining their aerodynamic properties. The Emperor's examination of his recovered son revealed that Sanguinius's genetic template had not only survived intact, but had actually been enhanced by his experiences on Baal Secundus. The constant exposure to radiation that would have killed or mutated any other being had instead triggered dormant sequences in his Primarch genetics, unlocking capabilities that even the Emperor had not fully anticipated. His psychic abilities were stronger than originally designed, and his physical capabilities exceeded even the considerable parameters built into his genetic structure. The transformation of the Ninth Legion began immediately following the reunion between the Emperor and Sanguinius. The Legion, which had been known simply as the Revenant Legion due to their pale appearance and tendency to return from battles that should have destroyed them, was rechristened as the Blood Angels in honor of their Primarch's origins among the tribes of Baal Secundus. The name carried multiple meanings. It honored both the pure blood that Sanguinius represented to his adopted people and the angelic nature that his wings so obviously proclaimed. The genetic material of Sanguinius was immediately integrated into the Legion's recruitment and enhancement processes. The apothecaries of the Ninth Legion worked alongside the Emperor's own gene rights to ensure that the Primarch's genetic legacy would be properly preserved and transmitted to his sons. The process was not without its complexities, as Sanguinius's enhanced genetics carried with them certain peculiarities that would need to be carefully managed in the creation of new Space Marines. The reunion between Sanguinius and his Legion was marked by an immediate and profound connection. The Space Marines of the Ninth Legion felt the presence of their gene father like a missing piece of their souls suddenly restored. Many reported experiencing visions or dreams in the days following the reunion, glimpses of memories that seemed to belong to Sanguinius himself. This psychic resonance between the Primarch and his sons would become one of the defining characteristics of the Blood Angels Legion. The physical changes in the Legion's new recruits became apparent within months of beginning the integration of Sanguinius's genetic material. The pale, almost corpse-like appearance that had given the Revenant Legion its name was replaced by a more vibrant and healthy complexion. The new Blood Angels possessed an almost supernatural beauty that reflected their Primarch's own perfect features, though none would ever develop wings like their father. Their psychic potential was also enhanced, with many showing empathic abilities that allowed them to coordinate in battle with an efficiency that bordered on telepathic communication. The transformation of Baal and its moons under Sanguinius's rule began with the establishment of a new order that would reshape the savage tribal culture that had dominated the system for millennia. Where once dozens of mutant clans had warred endlessly over scarce resources and territorial claims, the Primarch instituted a complex feudal system that channeled their warrior instincts into more constructive purposes. The strongest and most capable tribal leaders were elevated to positions of authority within this new hierarchy, their loyalty secured not through fear, but through genuine respect for Sanguinius's vision of unity and purpose. The radioactive wastelands of Baal Secundus, which had served as the crucible of Sanguinius's youth, became the foundation upon which he would build his domain. The Primarch understood that the harsh environment which had shaped him could serve the same purpose for future generations of his sons. Rather than attempting to terraform the irradiated surface or relocate his people to more hospitable worlds, he embraced the brutal conditions as a necessary component of the Blood Angels' identity. The constant exposure to danger and hardship would ensure that only the strongest and most determined candidates would survive to join his legion. The establishment of the fortress monastery on Baal itself marked the beginning of a new chapter in the system's history. Sanguinius chose the site carefully, positioning the massive structure atop a series of natural rock formations that provided both defensive advantages and symbolic significance. The monastery's design reflected the Primarch's unique aesthetic sensibilities, combining the practical requirements of a military installation with architectural elements that elevated it beyond mere functionality. Soaring spires reached toward the crimson sky like outstretched wings, their surfaces adorned with intricate carvings that told the story of the Blood Angels' origins and their Primarch's rise to power. The construction of the fortress monastery required the mobilization of resources from across the entire Baal system. Tribal craftsmen who had previously devoted their skills to creating crude weapons and survival tools found themselves working alongside imperial architects and engineers to create something magnificent. The project served multiple purposes beyond its obvious military applications. It provided employment and purpose for the scattered populations of the system, while simultaneously demonstrating the benefits of cooperation under Sanguinius's leadership. Within the monastery's halls, Sanguinius established the traditions that would define the Blood Angels for millennia to come. The Primarch's own experiences among the mutant tribes had taught him the importance of ritual and ceremony in binding disparate groups together. He created elaborate initiation rites that honored both the aspirants' tribal heritage and their new identity as Blood Angels. These ceremonies incorporated elements from the various clan traditions throughout the system, ensuring that no group felt excluded from the new order, while simultaneously creating a shared cultural foundation for the Legion. The Red Grail became the central focus of these rituals, though its true significance would not be fully understood until much later in the Legion's history. Sanguinius presented it as a symbol of unity and sacrifice, requiring each new Blood Angel to drink from it as part of their final initiation. The Primarch's own blood, mixed with that of his first followers from the Pure Blood tribe, sanctified the vessel and created a literal blood bond between all members of the Legion. This practice established the foundation for the complex relationship between the Blood Angels and their gene seed, though the darker implications of this connection remained hidden beneath layers of noble symbolism. The pacification of Baal's mutant populations presented unique challenges that required both military might and diplomatic finesse. Many of the more heavily mutated clans viewed Sanguinius's rise with suspicion, seeing his perfection as a rejection of their own twisted forms. The Primarch's approach to these groups demonstrated his tactical brilliance and understanding of human nature. Rather than simply crushing them through superior force, he sought to understand the root causes of their hostility and address them through carefully crafted solutions. The most severely mutated tribes, those whose forms had been so twisted by radiation that they barely retained human intelligence, posed the greatest threat to Sanguinius's vision of unity. These creatures, known locally as the Forsaken, had devolved into little more than feral beasts that attacked anything that entered their territories. The Primarch's forces conducted systematic campaigns against these groups, not out of hatred, but from necessity. The areas they controlled contained valuable resources and strategic positions that would be essential for the development of the Blood Angels' infrastructure. These military operations served as training exercises for the growing numbers of Blood Angels, allowing them to hone their combat skills against opponents that posed genuine threats without the political complications of fighting other Imperial forces. The Forsaken's unpredictable tactics and inhuman resilience provided excellent preparation for the challenges the Legion would face during the Great Crusade. Sanguinius himself led many of these campaigns, using them as opportunities to demonstrate proper leadership techniques to his subordinates, while also maintaining his connection to the harsh realities of warfare. The integration of worthy candidates from the less mutated populations required careful screening and evaluation processes. Sanguinius established recruitment centers throughout the system, each staffed with apothecaries and chaplains trained to identify individuals with the genetic stability necessary to survive the transformation into Space Marines. The Primarch's empathic abilities allowed him to personally evaluate the most promising candidates, sensing not only their physical potential, but also their psychological suitability for the demanding life of a Blood Angel. The selection process reflected Sanguinius's understanding that true strength came from more than just physical prowess. Candidates were tested for their artistic sensibilities as well as their martial skills, with particular attention paid to their ability to appreciate beauty even in the midst of violence and destruction. This emphasis on aesthetic appreciation became one of the defining characteristics of the Blood Angels, setting them apart from other legions that focused purely on military effectiveness. The development of the Blood Angels' unique philosophy began during these early years on Baal, as Sanguinius sought to create warriors who embodied both the nobility of angels and the fierce determination of survivors. He established schools within the fortress monastery, where aspirants could study not only the arts of war, but also music, sculpture, painting, and poetry. The Primarch believed that exposure to beauty and creativity would serve as a counterbalance to the inevitable brutalization that came with constant warfare. This artistic education was not merely decorative, but served practical purposes within the Legion's structure. Blood Angels who could appreciate the aesthetic qualities of their weapons and armor took better care of their equipment, ensuring peak performance in combat situations. Those who understood the principles of artistic composition could better analyze battlefield layouts and identify tactical opportunities that might escape less cultured warriors. The combination of martial prowess with artistic sensibility created a unique warrior culture that would become legendary throughout the Imperium. The establishment of workshops and studios within the fortress monastery allowed Blood Angels to create works of art during their downtime between campaigns. These spaces became gathering places where battle brothers could share experiences and bond over shared creative endeavors. The Primarch often visited these workshops personally, offering guidance and encouragement to aspiring artists while also using these informal meetings to assess the morale and mental state of his warriors. Sanguinius's own artistic abilities served as inspiration for his sons, though none could match the perfection of their Primarch's creations. His sculptures captured the essence of movement and emotion in ways that seemed almost supernatural, while his paintings depicted scenes of such beauty that viewers often found themselves moved to tears. The Primarch's poetry, composed in the ancient dialects of Baal's tribes, preserved the oral traditions of the system while elevating them to new heights of literary achievement. The integration of these cultural elements into the Blood Angels' military structure required careful balance to ensure that artistic pursuits did not interfere with combat readiness. Sanguinius established clear guidelines that prioritized military duties while still allowing time for creative expression. Training schedules incorporated periods specifically designated for artistic activities, recognizing that these pursuits contributed to the overall mental health and effectiveness of the legion. The fortress monasteries' libraries became repositories for both military knowledge and cultural artifacts from across the Baal system. Tribal histories, songs, and legends were carefully recorded and preserved, ensuring that the rich heritage of the system's peoples would not be lost in the transition to imperial rule. These archives also served as research facilities, where Blood Angels could study the tactical approaches of other legions and develop new strategies suited to their unique capabilities and fighting style. The Emperor's recognition of Sanguinius as one of his most trusted generals came not merely from their blood bond as father and son, but from the Primarch's demonstrated ability to achieve compliance through methods that preserved both imperial resources and human lives. Where other Primarchs might have required extensive fleets and prolonged sieges to bring worlds into the imperial fold, Sanguinius often accomplished the same objectives with surgical precision and minimal collateral damage. His reputation as the Great Angel preceded him across the galaxy, and many worlds surrendered at the mere sight of his golden fleet dropping out of the warp. The Blood Angels' integration into the broader Great Crusade began with a series of compliance actions in the Segmentum Solar, where the Legion could operate under the direct oversight of the Emperor while establishing their operational doctrine. These early campaigns revealed the unique advantages that Sanguinius brought to imperial expansion efforts. His empathic abilities allowed him to understand the motivations and fears of planetary governors and military commanders, enabling him to craft diplomatic approaches that addressed their specific concerns rather than relying on generic threats or promises. The first major test of Sanguinius's command abilities came during the compliance of Melchior, a heavily industrialized world whose ruling techno-aristocracy had initially welcomed imperial contact before retreating into their fortified hive cities when they learned the true scope of imperial demands. The planet's surface was dominated by massive manufacturing complexes that produced advanced machinery and weapons systems, making it a valuable addition to the growing Imperium's industrial base. However, the entrenched defenders possessed sophisticated defensive systems and had spent decades preparing for exactly this type of assault. Previous compliance efforts on similar worlds had typically involved prolonged orbital bombardments followed by costly ground assaults that often resulted in the destruction of the very infrastructure the Imperium sought to capture. Sanguinius approached the problem from an entirely different angle, recognizing that the techno-aristocrats' resistance stemmed not from ideological opposition to imperial rule, but from fear of losing their privileged positions within the planetary hierarchy. Rather than beginning with displays of overwhelming force, he initiated contact through carefully crafted diplomatic overtures that emphasized the benefits of willing cooperation. The Primarch's first step involved detailed reconnaissance missions conducted by Blood Angels equipped with jump packs, who could infiltrate the Hive City's upper levels without triggering the ground-based defensive systems. These warriors gathered intelligence not only on military capabilities, but also on the political dynamics within the ruling class, identifying potential allies and sources of internal conflict that could be exploited through negotiation rather than violence. The information they gathered revealed a complex web of rivalries and competing interests that had been masked by the appearance of unified resistance. Sanguinius personally led diplomatic missions to the less fortified settlements on Melchior's surface, demonstrating the benefits of imperial membership through practical improvements to infrastructure and living conditions. His presence alone was enough to inspire confidence among the common workers, whose living conditions had deteriorated under the increasing paranoia of their rulers. The Primarch's ability to understand and address their concerns created a groundswell of popular support that put additional pressure on the techno-aristocrats to reconsider their position. The breakthrough came when Sanguinius identified a faction within the ruling class that had been marginalized by the current power structure and offered them positions of authority within the imperial administration. These negotiations required delicate handling, as any appearance of favoritism toward particular groups could have triggered the very conflict the Primarch was trying to avoid. His diplomatic skills proved equal to the challenge, crafting agreements that satisfied the ambitions of his new allies, while providing face-saving measures for their former rivals. The final phase of the Melchior compliance involved a carefully choreographed demonstration of the Blood Angel's military capabilities, designed to convince any remaining holdouts that resistance would be futile, while simultaneously showcasing the precision and restraint that characterized the Legion's approach to warfare. Sanguinius led a formation of jump pack-equipped Blood Angels in a series of aerial maneuvers above the primary hive city, their movements synchronized with mathematical precision as they wove between the towering spires and defensive installations. The display served multiple purposes beyond simple intimidation. It demonstrated the futility of the defensive systems that the techno-aristocrats had spent so much effort constructing, as the Blood Angels' aerial mobility allowed them to bypass or neutralize these obstacles with ease. More importantly, it showed the inhabitants of Melchior that Imperial forces could operate with surgical precision, targeting specific threats while leaving civilian areas completely untouched. This combination of overwhelming capability with obvious restraint convinced even the most stubborn holdouts that cooperation offered better prospects than continued resistance. The successful compliance of Melchior established a template that Sanguinius would refine and adapt throughout the Great Crusade. The combination of detailed intelligence gathering, diplomatic outreach, and precisely applied military pressure proved effective across a wide range of planetary cultures and political systems. Word of the Blood Angels' methods spread throughout the Imperial fleet, and other legions began requesting joint operations with Sanguinius's forces when facing particularly challenging compliance scenarios. The Blood Angels' reputation for swift, devastating assaults developed alongside their diplomatic capabilities, as situations inevitably arose where negotiation proved impossible or insufficient. The Legion's mastery of aerial warfare tactics gave them significant advantages in these scenarios, allowing them to achieve tactical objectives that would have required much larger forces using conventional ground-based approaches. Their jump pack-equipped assault squads could strike at enemy command centers, communication facilities, and supply depots simultaneously, creating chaos and confusion that often led to rapid enemy collapse. The development of these tactics required extensive training and coordination that went far beyond the capabilities of ordinary space marines. Blood Angels' assault squads spent countless hours practicing aerial maneuvers in the varied environments they encountered during the Great Crusade, from the crushing gravity wells of high-density worlds to the thin atmospheres of frontier mining colonies. Their jump packs were modified and upgraded constantly, incorporating improvements suggested by field experience and technological advances developed by the Legion's tech marines. Sanguinius himself served as the ultimate expression of aerial warfare capabilities, his natural wings providing advantages that no technological enhancement could match. His ability to change direction instantaneously, hover motionless above a battlefield, or dive at speeds that would destroy mechanical systems made him a devastating force multiplier in any engagement. Enemy commanders who had prepared defenses against conventional aerial assault found their carefully laid plans useless against an opponent who could maneuver in 3 dimensions with perfect precision. The Primarch's combat style in these engagements combined his supernatural speed and agility with tactical brilliance that allowed him to identify and exploit weaknesses in enemy formations within seconds of engaging them. His preferred weapon, the blade in carmine, had been crafted specifically to complement his aerial combat techniques, its length and balance perfect for the sweeping strikes and precise thrusts that characterized his fighting style. The sight of the great angel diving from the sky with his golden blade gleaming became one of the most feared and respected images of the Great Crusade. The Blood Angel's aerial tactics were not limited to direct assault operations, but included reconnaissance, rapid deployment, and extraction missions that supported broader strategic objectives. Their ability to insert small teams deep behind enemy lines without detection proved invaluable in gathering intelligence and conducting sabotage operations that weakened enemy resistance before major engagements began. These missions required not only exceptional piloting skills, but also the ability to operate independently for extended periods while maintaining operational security. The Legion Stormbirds and other aircraft were modified to support these specialized operations, with enhanced stealth capabilities and extended range that allowed them to operate far from their base ships. Blood Angel's pilots developed techniques for low-altitude penetration flights that took advantage of terrain features and atmospheric conditions to avoid detection by enemy sensors. These skills proved particularly valuable when operating in conjunction with other legions, as the Blood Angels could provide reconnaissance and target designation services that enhanced the effectiveness of allied forces. The integration of aerial warfare doctrine with the Blood Angels' artistic sensibilities created a unique approach to military operations that emphasized elegance and efficiency over brute force. Battle plans were crafted with the same attention to aesthetic principles that the Legion applied to their artwork, seeking solutions that achieved maximum effect with minimum waste. This approach often resulted in tactical innovations that other legions adopted for their own use, though few could match the Blood Angel's execution of these techniques. The success of these methods led to Sanguinius being assigned increasingly complex and sensitive compliance missions throughout the Great Crusade. The Emperor recognized that the Primarch's combination of diplomatic skill, tactical brilliance, and inspirational leadership made him uniquely suited for situations where conventional military approaches might prove counterproductive. These assignments often involved worlds with significant strategic value that could not be risked through destructive siege warfare or orbital bombardment. The reputation that preceded Sanguinius and his legion across the galaxy became a weapon in its own right, as planetary governors and military commanders often chose to negotiate rather than face the Blood Angels in battle. Stories of the Great Angel's mercy toward those who submitted willingly spread alongside tales of his terrible wrath against those who chose defiance, creating a psychological advantage that made many compliance actions unnecessary. The mere appearance of the Blood Angel's golden fleet in a system's outer reaches was often enough to initiate surrender negotiations before any hostile action became necessary. The first manifestations of what would later be known as the Red Thirst appeared within the Blood Angels Legion during the early decades of the Great Crusade, though its initial symptoms were so subtle that even the Legion's apothecaries failed to recognize them as harbingers of a deeper genetic corruption. The earliest recorded incidents involved individual battle brothers displaying unusually aggressive behavior during combat operations, their normal tactical discipline giving way to frenzied assaults that, while effective, seemed driven by something beyond mere battlefield fury. These warriors would emerge from engagements with their armor splattered in enemy blood, their breathing labored not from exertion, but from what appeared to be an almost narcotic satisfaction. The condition first drew serious attention following the compliance of Xerxes Prime, where a squad of Blood Angels assault marines had pursued fleeing enemy forces far beyond their assigned objectives, slaughtering retreating soldiers with a savagery that disturbed even their battle-hardened comrades. The affected marines showed no memory of their actions beyond the initial engagement, describing their experiences as though viewing them through a crimson haze that had descended over their vision. Medical examinations revealed elevated levels of stress hormones and unusual neural activity in regions of the brain associated with predatory instincts, but the Legion's apothecaries attributed these findings to combat fatigue and recommended extended rest periods. Sanguinius himself first became aware of the developing crisis when Captain Erasmus Tycho of the 3rd Company approached him with concerns about increasing incidents of what the officer diplomatically termed excessive battlefield enthusiasm among his troops. The Primarch's empathic abilities immediately detected the deeper currents of fear and confusion that Tycho was attempting to conceal, recognizing that the situation was far more serious than the captain's carefully chosen words suggested. A private meeting between the two revealed the full scope of the problem, as Tycho described battle brothers who seemed to derive an unhealthy pleasure from the act of killing, their post-combat behavior displaying signs of withdrawal and depression when denied opportunities for violence. The Primarch's investigation into these incidents led him to examine the genetic records maintained by the Legion's apothecaries, searching for patterns that might explain the behavioral anomalies. What he discovered filled him with a cold dread that he struggled to conceal from his subordinates. The affected Marines all showed subtle variations in their gene seed implantation, minor deviations from the standard template that had been dismissed as acceptable variants during the initial screening process. These variations clustered around specific genetic markers that traced directly back to Sanguinius's own enhanced physiology, suggesting that the flaw originated within the Primarch himself. The realization that he was the source of his son's corruption struck Sanguinius with devastating force. His enhanced genetics, which had allowed him to survive and thrive on the radiation-soaked surface of Baal Secundus, carried within them the seeds of a curse that would plague every Marine created from his gene seed. The irony was not lost on the Primarch that his greatest gift to his Legion, the genetic perfection that made them superior warriors, also contained the mechanism of their potential damnation. The empathic connection that allowed him to understand and inspire his sons also meant that he could feel their growing hunger as a constant ache in his own psyche. The decision to conceal the flaw's existence from the Emperor and his brother Primarchs came not from shame, but from a desperate desire to protect his Legion from the consequences of discovery. Sanguinius understood that revelation of a genetic defect within his gene seed would likely result in the disbanding of the Blood Angels, their surviving members distributed among other legions or subjected to extensive medical experimentation. The thought of his sons suffering such a fate was unbearable to the Primarch, who had come to view each Blood Angel as an extension of his own family. The tribes of Baal had taught him the importance of loyalty and protection of one's own, lessons that now guided his response to this crisis. The development of containment protocols began with the establishment of a secret cadre of senior officers and apothecaries who were briefed on the true nature of the affliction. Chief Apothecary Miros, whose loyalty to Sanguinius was absolute and whose discretion was unquestioned, became the primary architect of the systems designed to identify and manage affected battle brothers. The protocols involved careful monitoring of all Legion personnel for early warning signs, including psychological evaluations disguised as routine medical examinations and behavioral assessments conducted by chaplains trained to recognize the subtle indicators of developing bloodlust. The identification process required extraordinary subtlety to avoid arousing suspicion among the general Legion population. Miros developed a series of medical tests that could detect the genetic markers associated with the flaw while appearing to be standard health screenings. Blood samples were analyzed for specific enzyme levels that correlated with the condition's progression, while neural scans were conducted under the pretense of monitoring for combat-related brain injuries. The data from these examinations was compiled in encrypted files that only a handful of individuals were authorized to access, creating a shadow medical infrastructure within the Legion's normal healthcare system. The management of affected Marines presented even greater challenges than their identification. The early stages of the Red Thirst could be controlled through careful assignment of duties and close supervision by unaffected squad members, but the condition's progressive nature meant that temporary measures would eventually prove insufficient. Sanguinius authorized the construction of specialized containment facilities within the depths of the fortress monastery on Baal, chambers designed to house battle brothers whose condition had progressed beyond the point where they could safely interact with their comrades or civilian populations. These containment facilities were officially designated as meditation chambers, spaces where battle brothers could retreat for spiritual contemplation and recovery from the stresses of continuous warfare. The reality was far darker, as the chambers were equipped with restraint systems and monitoring equipment designed to prevent the contained Marines from harming themselves or others during episodes of uncontrolled bloodlust. The affected warriors were attended by specially trained serfs who understood the risks involved and were equipped with emergency procedures for dealing with violent outbursts. The psychological impact of these measures on the affected Marines was profound and tragic. Warriors who had once been exemplars of imperial virtue found themselves gradually isolated from their battle brothers as their condition worsened. The shame and confusion they experienced was compounded by their inability to understand why they were being subjected to increasingly restrictive supervision. Many developed severe depression as they realized that their military careers were effectively over, their dreams of glorious service to the emperor reduced to a nightmare of constant surveillance and gradual degradation. Sanguinius felt every moment of his son's suffering as though it were his own, the empathic bond that connected him to the Legion, ensuring that he could not escape the consequences of his genetic legacy. The Primarch's own psychological state began to deteriorate under the weight of this burden, his naturally optimistic disposition giving way to periods of brooding melancholy that he struggled to conceal from his subordinates. The artistic pursuits that had once brought him joy became tainted by the knowledge that the same genetic gifts that enabled his creative abilities also condemned his sons to eventual madness. The establishment of the Death Company, though it would not receive that name until much later in the Legion's history, began during this period as a desperate attempt to find some constructive use for Marines whose condition had progressed beyond containment. Sanguinius authorized the formation of specialized assault units composed entirely of affected warriors, their uncontrolled aggression channeled into suicide missions against the most dangerous enemy positions. These units were equipped with the finest weapons and armor available, their inevitable deaths at least serving a tactical purpose while sparing them the prolonged suffering of complete mental collapse. The command structure for these units required careful consideration, as traditional leadership methods proved ineffective when dealing with warriors driven by genetic compulsion rather than tactical discipline. Sanguinius assigned his most trusted chaplains to oversee these formations, their spiritual authority providing some measure of control over the affected Marines, while their understanding of the true situation allowed them to make the difficult decisions required to manage such dangerous assets. The chaplains who accepted these assignments knew that they were essentially presiding over elaborate funeral rites, guiding their charges through their final service to the Legion. The secrecy required to maintain these operations placed enormous strain on the Blood Angels' command structure. Officers who were aware of the true situation were forced to lie to their subordinates and peers, creating an atmosphere of suspicion and paranoia that undermined the trust that had previously characterized the Legion's internal relationships. The constant fear of discovery led to increasingly elaborate deceptions, as cover stories had to be maintained and evidence of the flaw's existence carefully concealed or destroyed. The impact on recruitment and training procedures was equally significant, as the Legion's apothecaries were forced to implement additional screening measures that could identify potential carriers of the genetic defect before they underwent the transformation process. These measures were disguised as enhancements to the existing selection criteria, with candidates being evaluated for psychological stability and genetic compatibility using tests that were actually designed to detect markers associated with the red thirst. The rejection rate for potential recruits increased substantially, though this was attributed to the Legion's commitment to maintaining the highest possible standards. The development of these containment protocols required resources that had to be diverted from other Legion activities without arousing suspicion. Construction projects within the fortress monastery were expanded to include the specialized facilities needed for housing affected Marines, while medical supplies and equipment were requisitioned under false pretenses to support the shadow healthcare infrastructure. The financial and logistical burden of maintaining these operations was substantial, requiring creative accounting practices and careful manipulation of supply requisitions to avoid detection by imperial auditors. The psychological toll on Sanguinius himself continued to mount as the scope of the crisis became apparent. The Primarch's prescient abilities, which had once been a source of confidence and tactical advantage, now tormented him with visions of his legion's eventual fate. He saw glimpses of futures where the red thirst consumed entire companies, where his sons turned on each other in frenzied bloodbaths, where the Blood Angels became the very monsters they had sworn to destroy. These visions drove him to increasingly desperate measures, searching for solutions that might arrest or reverse the genetic degradation affecting his gene seed. The research conducted into potential treatments for the condition was necessarily limited by the need for secrecy, as extensive genetic experimentation would have attracted unwanted attention from the Emperor's own gene rights and the Mechanicum's biology's adepts. Miros and his team worked with primitive equipment and limited resources, their efforts hampered by the inability to collaborate with the broader scientific community of the Imperium. Progress was slow and often disappointing, with each promising lead ultimately revealing itself to be another dead end in the search for a cure. The isolation that these circumstances imposed on Sanguinius was perhaps the cruelest aspect of his burden. The Primarch, who had once been renowned for his openness and emotional connection with others, found himself increasingly withdrawn, unable to share his fears and concerns with even his closest advisors. The weight of command had always been heavy, but the knowledge that he was personally responsible for his son's suffering transformed that burden into something almost unbearable. The great halls of the fortress monastery, once filled with the sounds of celebration and camaraderie, seemed to echo with the unspoken anguish of their master. The bonds that formed between Sanguinius and his brother Primarchs during the Great Crusade represented some of the strongest fraternal relationships within the Emperor's extended family, forged through shared trials and mutual respect that transcended the competitive nature that characterized many inter-legion interactions. Among all these relationships, none proved more significant or ultimately more tragic than his friendship with Horus Lupercal, the War Master whose charisma and tactical brilliance had earned him their father's trust as first among equals. The two Primarchs had discovered an immediate kinship during their first meeting at the Triumph of Ulanor, recognizing in each other the rare combination of martial prowess and genuine concern for the welfare of their subordinates that set them apart from some of their more ruthless brothers. Horus had been drawn to Sanguinius not merely by his reputation as the great angel, but by the Primarch's ability to inspire loyalty through example rather than intimidation. Where other Primarchs commanded respect through displays of superior strength or intellectual dominance, Sanguinius earned devotion through his willingness to share both the burdens and glories of command with those who served under him. This approach resonated deeply with Horus, whose own leadership style emphasized the importance of personal connections and emotional bonds in maintaining unit cohesion across the vast distances and extended campaigns that characterized the Great Crusade. The friendship between the two Primarchs manifested itself in numerous joint operations throughout the Crusade, where their complementary skills created a formidable partnership that achieved compliance on worlds that had previously resisted imperial expansion. Horus's strategic vision and political acumen combined seamlessly with Sanguinius's diplomatic abilities and tactical flexibility, allowing them to approach complex situations from multiple angles simultaneously. Their forces developed synchronized operational procedures that maximized the effectiveness of both legions, with the Luna Wolves' aggressive assault tactics providing the hammer against which Sanguinius's more precise Blood Angel strikes could serve as the anvil. The personal relationship between Horus and Sanguinius extended beyond mere professional cooperation into genuine fraternal affection that was evident to all who observed them together. The War Master, who often maintained a careful emotional distance from his other brothers to preserve his authority as their superior, displayed an unguarded warmth towards Sanguinius that revealed the depth of his regard. Similarly, the angel's empathic abilities allowed him to perceive the genuine goodness that that existed within Horus's ambitious nature, recognizing that his brother's desire for recognition and achievement was balanced by a sincere commitment to the ideals of the Great Crusade. This relationship proved crucial during several diplomatic crises that threatened to escalate into unnecessary conflicts between imperial forces and potentially compliant worlds. Sanguinius's ability to understand and address the concerns of planetary governors and military commanders was enhanced by Horus's political instincts and understanding of the broader strategic implications of various diplomatic approaches. Together, they developed negotiation strategies that addressed both immediate tactical concerns and long-term administrative requirements, creating frameworks for planetary integration that served as models for other compliance operations throughout the galaxy. The bond with Jagatai Khan of the White Scars represented a different but equally meaningful relationship, built upon mutual respect for each other's approach to warfare and a shared appreciation for the aesthetic dimensions of military excellence. The Khan's mastery of rapid strike tactics and his understanding of warfare as an art form resonated with Sanguinius's own tactical philosophy, creating a foundation for friendship that was strengthened by their similar perspectives on the relationship between beauty and violence. Both Primarchs viewed combat not merely as a means to achieve strategic objectives, but as an expression of skill and creativity that could achieve a form of terrible perfection when executed properly. Their joint campaigns against the Orc empires in the Kondak system demonstrated the effectiveness of combining the White Scars' lightning warfare with the Blood Angels' aerial assault capabilities. The two legions developed coordinated tactics that allowed them to achieve devastating results against numerically superior enemies, with the Khan's forces drawing enemy formations into predetermined positions where Sanguinius's jump pack-equipped warriors could strike with maximum effect. These operations required precise timing and flawless communication between the two forces, achievements that were only possible because of the deep trust and understanding that existed between their Primarchs. The friendship between Sanguinius and Jagatai was characterized by long philosophical discussions about the nature of warfare and the responsibilities of command, conversations that often took place during the quiet periods between major campaigns when both Primarchs could temporarily set aside their operational duties. The Khan's nomadic upbringing on Chogoris had given him a perspective on freedom and individual responsibility that complemented Sanguinius's own experiences among the tribal peoples of Baal, creating a shared understanding of the importance of maintaining cultural identity even within the rigid structures of imperial compliance. These discussions helped both Primarchs develop more nuanced approaches to planetary integration that preserved local traditions while still achieving the administrative standardization required by imperial law. The relationship with Roboute Guilliman of the Ultramarines represented perhaps the most intellectually stimulating of Sanguinius's fraternal bonds, built upon mutual respect for each other's administrative capabilities and strategic thinking. Guilliman's systematic approach to governance and his development of comprehensive protocols for planetary administration complemented Sanguinius's more intuitive understanding of human motivation and social dynamics. The two Primarchs often collaborated on the development of compliance procedures that balanced the Ultramarines' emphasis on efficiency and standardization with the Blood Angels' focus on preserving local cultural elements that could contribute to long-term stability. Their joint efforts in developing the administrative frameworks that would later influence the structure of the Codex Astartes demonstrated the effectiveness of combining Guilliman's organizational genius with Sanguinius's understanding of human psychology. The Angel's empathic abilities allowed him to identify potential sources of resistance or instability within newly compliant populations, information that Guilliman could then incorporate into his administrative plans to address these issues before they became serious problems. This collaborative approach resulted in compliance operations that achieved both immediate tactical success and long-term administrative stability, creating models that were adopted by other legions throughout the Crusade. The intellectual discussions between Guilliman and Sanguinius covered a wide range of topics beyond military strategy and administration, including philosophy, ethics, and the long-term vision for humanity's future within the galaxy. Guilliman's rational approach to these subjects provided a valuable counterpoint to Sanguinius's more emotionally informed perspectives, creating debates that challenged both Primarchs to refine and develop their thinking. These conversations often took place in the libraries and study chambers of their respective flagships, surrounded by texts and data slates containing the accumulated knowledge of countless human civilizations that had been brought into imperial compliance. The most complex and ultimately tragic of Sanguinius's relationships with his brother Primarchs was his connection to Conrad Curze of the Night Lords, a bond forged by their shared burden of prescient visions that revealed potential futures with disturbing clarity. Both Primarchs possessed the ability to perceive glimpses of what might come to pass, though their interpretations of these visions and their responses to the knowledge they contained could not have been more different. Where Sanguinius struggled to use his foresight to guide his actions toward the most positive outcomes possible, Curze seemed driven to fulfill the darkest prophecies his abilities revealed, creating a self-fulfilling cycle of violence and despair. The first meeting between Sanguinius and Curze had been marked by an immediate recognition of their shared psychic burden, a moment of understanding that transcended their vastly different personalities and approaches to command. Curze's visions of his own death and the eventual corruption of his legion had created a fatalistic worldview that stood in stark contrast to Sanguinius's determination to forge a better future despite the dark possibilities his own prescience revealed. The angel's attempts to counsel his troubled brother were met with a mixture of gratitude and resentment, as Curze simultaneously craved the understanding that only Sanguinius could provide while rejecting the hope that such understanding might offer. The philosophical discussions between the two Primarchs often centered on the question of whether prescient visions represented inevitable futures or merely potential outcomes that could be altered through conscious action. Sanguinius maintained that foreknowledge created responsibility, arguing that those who could perceive potential disasters had an obligation to work toward preventing them, even if success seemed unlikely. Curze countered that attempts to alter predicted outcomes were futile exercises in self-deception, maintaining that the visions they shared were glimpses of fixed destiny rather than warnings about changeable possibilities. These debates took on added poignancy as both Primarchs struggled with visions that revealed their own eventual fates. Sanguinius had seen glimpses of his death at the hands of Horus, images that filled him with sorrow not for his own demise, but for the betrayal and corruption that such a future would represent. Curze's visions of his own assassination by an agent of the Emperor created a bitter certainty that his loyalty would ultimately be rewarded with execution, a prophecy that poisoned his relationship with their father and contributed to his eventual fall to chaos. The parallel nature of their prophetic burdens created a unique understanding between them, even as their different responses to this knowledge drove them toward opposite destinies. The role that Sanguinius played as mediator in disputes between his brother Primarchs emerged naturally from his empathic abilities and his reputation for fairness and wisdom. His capacity to understand the emotional undercurrents that drove conflicts between his brothers made him uniquely qualified to identify the root causes of disagreements and propose solutions that address the legitimate concerns of all parties involved. This mediation role was not formally assigned by the Emperor or the War Master, but developed organically as other Primarchs began to seek out Sanguinius's counsel when faced with difficult interpersonal situations. One of the most significant examples of this mediation occurred during a dispute between Leman Russ of the Space Wolves and Magnus, the Red of the Thousand Suns, two Primarchs whose fundamentally different approaches to the use of psychic powers had created a deep philosophical rift that threatened to spill over into open conflict between their legions. Russ's instinctive distrust of sorcery and his belief that psychic abilities represented a dangerous corruption of human nature stood in direct opposition to Magnus's conviction that psychic powers were humanity's evolutionary destiny and should be embraced rather than feared. The tension between these positions had reached a critical point during a joint compliance operation where the two legions were forced to work together despite their ideological differences. Incidents of violence between individual Marines from both legions had escalated to the point where their Primarchs were considering formal challenges to resolve their differences through single combat, a solution that would have solved nothing while potentially weakening both forces at a crucial stage of the campaign. Sanguinius's intervention came at the request of Horus, who recognized that the situation required someone with the diplomatic skills and moral authority necessary to defuse the crisis. The mediation process required Sanguinius to understand and address the legitimate concerns that drove both Primarchs' positions while finding common ground that could serve as the foundation for a workable compromise. His empathic abilities allowed him to perceive that Russ's hostility towards psychic powers was rooted in genuine concern for the safety of humanity rather than simple prejudice, while Magnus's advocacy for psychic development was motivated by a sincere belief that such abilities could benefit the species as a whole. By acknowledging the validity of both perspectives and identifying areas where their goals aligned, Sanguinius was able to craft a framework for cooperation that satisfied both parties without requiring either to abandon their core principles. The success of this mediation enhanced Sanguinius's reputation as a peacemaker among his brothers, leading to requests for his intervention in other disputes that might otherwise have escalated into serious conflicts. His approach to these situations was always characterized by patience and careful listening, allowing all parties to express their concerns fully before attempting to identify solutions. This method required significant time and emotional investment, but consistently produced results that preserved the unity of purpose that was essential for the success of the Great Crusade. The burden of serving as mediator for his brother's conflicts took a significant toll on Sanguinius's own emotional well-being, particularly as he struggled with the growing crisis of the Red Thirst within his own legion. The irony of counseling others while concealing his own deepest problems created an additional layer of stress that compounded the psychological pressure he was already experiencing. The empathic connections that made him such an effective mediator also meant that he absorbed some of the emotional turmoil of every conflict he helped resolve, adding to his own burden of worry and responsibility. The elevation of Horus Lupercal to the position of War Master marked a pivotal moment in the Great Crusade that Sanguinius greeted with genuine enthusiasm and unwavering support. When the Emperor announced his decision to withdraw from active campaign leadership and return to Terra for urgent projects that he could not delegate, the choice of Horus as his successor seemed both natural and inevitable to the Angel. Among all the Primarchs, none had demonstrated the combination of tactical brilliance, political acumen, and inspirational leadership that would be required to coordinate the vast military machine of imperial expansion across multiple galactic sectors simultaneously. Sanguinius's public endorsement of his brother's elevation carried significant weight among the other Primarchs, many of whom harbored their own ambitions for the supreme command position. The Angel's reputation for fairness and his lack of personal political agenda made his support particularly valuable in legitimizing Horus's authority over Primarchs who might otherwise have questioned the decision. During the ceremony on Ulanor, where the Emperor formally invested Horus with the title of War Master, Sanguinius stood prominently among the assembled Primarchs, his presence serving as a visible symbol of unity behind the new command structure. The reorganization of Crusade fleets under Horus's supreme command created new opportunities for collaboration between the Blood Angels and Luna Wolves that Sanguinius embraced enthusiastically. The War Master's strategic vision encompassed ambitious campaigns that would push Imperial expansion into previously unexplored regions of the galaxy, operations that would require the coordinated efforts of multiple legions working in concert rather than the independent actions that had characterized much of the earlier Crusade. The Angel's diplomatic skills and the Blood Angel's specialized capabilities made them natural partners for these complex undertakings. The first major campaign under Horus's direct command involved the pacification of the Kava's Belt, a cluster of heavily fortified mining worlds whose ruling oligarchy had managed to resist imperial expansion for decades through a combination of advanced defensive technology and strategic alliances with Xeno's mercenary forces. The operation required careful coordination between 5 separate Legion forces, each assigned specific objectives that would contribute to the overall strategic goal of bringing the entire system under imperial control without destroying the valuable industrial infrastructure that made it worth conquering in the first place. Sanguinius found himself impressed by the sophistication of Horus's operational planning, which took into account not only the immediate tactical requirements of the campaign, but also the long-term political and economic implications of various approaches to achieving compliance. The War Master had developed comprehensive contingency plans that addressed potential complications ranging from Xeno's intervention to internal political upheaval within the target worlds, demonstrating a level of strategic thinking that exceeded even the Angel's considerable expectations. The attention to detail and thorough preparation that characterized these plans reflected the lessons Horus had learned during his years of independent command, refined through experience into a systematic approach to large-scale military operations. The execution of the Kava's Belt campaign proceeded with mechanical precision, each phase unfolding according to Horus's carefully crafted timeline, despite the complex coordination required between the participating legions. The Blood Angels were assigned the crucial task of neutralizing the system's orbital defense platforms, using their aerial assault capabilities to insert strike teams onto the heavily shielded installations, while avoiding the overlapping fields of fire that had previously deterred Imperial attacks. The operation required split-second timing and flawless communication between multiple assault groups, challenges that the Legion met with the professional competence that had made them renowned throughout the Crusade forces. Sanguinius personally led the assault on the primary command station, a massive orbital fortress that controlled the defensive systems throughout the entire belt. The facility's designers had incorporated multiple redundant security measures and fail-safe systems that would have made conventional assault tactics prohibitively costly, but the Angel's prescient abilities allowed him to anticipate and counter the defenders' responses before they could implement their carefully prepared contingency plans. His strike force penetrated the station's outer defenses through a series of precisely timed attacks that exploited momentary gaps in the coverage patterns, reaching the central command complex before the garrison could organize an effective response. The success of the Kava's Belt operation established a template for future campaigns under Horus's command, demonstrating the effectiveness of the War Master's systematic approach to multi-legion coordination. The participating Primarchs found themselves impressed by their brothers' ability to synthesize their individual capabilities into a coherent strategic framework that maximized the strengths of each force while minimizing their respective weaknesses. The campaign's success also reinforced Sanguinius's confidence in Horus's leadership abilities, confirming his belief that the Emperor had chosen the right successor to guide the Great Crusade toward its ultimate objectives. However, as the months passed following the Kava's Belt victory, subtle changes in Horus's demeanor began to concern those closest to him, including Sanguinius, whose empathic abilities made him particularly sensitive to shifts in his brother's emotional state. The War Master's natural confidence and charismatic leadership style remained intact, but underneath these familiar qualities, the Angel detected currents of frustration and resentment that seemed to be growing stronger with each passing campaign. The burden of supreme command was clearly weighing heavily on Horus, though he maintained his public composure with the same skill that had always characterized his political interactions. The source of Horus's growing discontent became apparent during private conversations between the two Primarchs, discussions that revealed the War Master's increasing frustration with the constraints and limitations imposed by his new position. Where he had once enjoyed the freedom to pursue independent campaigns according to his own strategic vision, Horus now found himself bound by the need to coordinate his actions with the broader objectives established by the Emperor's withdrawal to Terra. The constant stream of communications from the imperial palace, filled with directives and policy changes that often seemed to contradict previous instructions, created an administrative burden that left little time for the direct military leadership that had always been his greatest strength. The War Master's complaints about the Emperor's apparent abandonment of the Great Crusade struck Sanguinius as particularly troubling, representing a fundamental shift in Horus's attitude toward their father that went beyond simple frustration with bureaucratic inefficiency. The Primarch, who had once spoken of the Emperor with reverent devotion, now expressed doubts about his priorities and commitment to the Crusade's success, questioning whether the mysterious projects on Terra could possibly be more important than the ongoing expansion of human dominion throughout the galaxy. These doubts seemed to poison Horus's perception of every communication from the Imperial Palace, transforming routine administrative updates into evidence of the Emperor's growing detachment from the Crusade forces. The changes in Horus's behavior were subtle enough that most observers failed to notice them, but Sanguinius's empathic sensitivity allowed him to perceive the growing darkness that seemed to be taking root in his brother's psyche. The War Master's famous charm and diplomatic skills remained as effective as ever in his interactions with other Primarchs and Imperial officials, but the Angel could sense the increasing effort required to maintain this facade. The genuine warmth and brotherhood that had once characterized their relationship was gradually being replaced by something more calculated and manipulative, though Horus himself seemed unaware of the transformation taking place within him. The first concrete indication of serious problems came during the compliance of Davin, a world whose primitive population had been corrupted by chaos cults that practiced ritual sacrifice and demon worship. The campaign should have been a routine operation for forces of the War Master's caliber, but the presence of chaos influences created complications that tested Horus's judgment and decision, making abilities in ways that previous enemies had not. The planet's warrior lodges had been infiltrated by cultists who used their positions of influence to spread corruption throughout the indigenous population, creating a complex web of loyalties and allegiances that made it difficult to distinguish between legitimate resistance and chaos-inspired rebellion. Sanguinius accompanied the War Master to Davin at Horus's personal request, bringing a substantial Blood Angels force to support the Luna Wolves in what was expected to be a straightforward compliance operation. The Angel's prescient abilities had been providing him with disturbing visions related to the campaign, fragmentary images of corruption and betrayal that he could not fully interpret, but which filled him with growing unease about the operation's likely outcome. These visions were more intense and troubling than any he had previously experienced, suggesting that the events on Davin would have consequences that extended far beyond the immediate tactical objectives of the campaign. The planetary assault proceeded according to standard Imperial doctrine, with the Luna Wolves spearheading the main attack, while the Blood Angels provided support operations and secured secondary objectives. The indigenous warriors fought with surprising skill and determination, their tactical coordination suggesting a level of organization that exceeded what Imperial intelligence had predicted based on the world's primitive technological base. The presence of weapons and equipment that clearly originated from off-world sources indicated that the local population had received assistance from external forces, though the identity and motivations of these allies remained unclear. The breakthrough in the campaign came when Horus personally led an assault on the primary temple complex, where the planet's ruling council was believed to be coordinating the resistance. The operation required penetrating multiple layers of defensive positions that had been constructed with an understanding of Imperial tactical doctrine that suggested the defenders had received detailed intelligence about Astartes' capabilities and limitations. The fighting was brutal and costly, with casualties mounting on both sides as the Luna Wolves pushed deeper into the temple's labyrinthine interior. Sanguinius's growing concerns about his brother's changing nature were validated in the most horrific way possible when Horus was mortally wounded by a weapon bearing the taint of chaos. a blade wielded by a corrupted priest whose dying strike opened wounds that refused to heal despite the Primarch's superhuman constitution. The injury defied all attempts at treatment by the Luna Wolves' apothecaries, the corruption within it actively resisting medical intervention while slowly spreading through Horus's system, like a spiritual poison that attacked his very essence rather than merely his physical form. The desperate search for a cure led to the decision to seek help from the local population, specifically from those elements that claimed knowledge of spiritual healing techniques that might counter the weapon's malevolent effects. This choice, made in desperation rather than wisdom, brought Horus into contact with the very chaos influences that had been corrupting Davon's population, creating an opportunity for the dark powers to work their corruption directly upon the Warmaster's vulnerable psyche. The healing ritual that followed would later be revealed as the moment when Horus's fall to chaos began in earnest, though the full extent of the corruption would not become apparent until much later. Sanguinius's prophetic visions during this period became increasingly intense and disturbing, filled with images of civil war and brother fighting brother that seemed to center on Horus himself. The angel saw glimpses of futures where the Warmaster led half the legions in rebellion against the Emperor, where the unity of the Great Crusade shattered into fratricidal conflict that would consume the galaxy in flames. These visions were so vivid and terrible that Sanguinius initially dismissed them as products of his own fears and anxieties, rather than genuine glimpses of potential futures, unable to accept that his beloved brother could ever betray everything they had fought to build together. The Blood Angels' continued loyalty to the Imperium during this period was never in question, despite their close ties to Horus and their Primarch's obvious affection for the Warmaster. Sanguinius had instilled in his legion a devotion to the Emperor and the ideals of the Great Crusade that transcended personal relationships, creating a foundation of loyalty that would prove unshakable even when tested by the most extreme circumstances. The Angel's own commitment to these principles served as an example to his sons, demonstrating that duty to the Imperium must take precedence over all other considerations, including brotherhood and personal affection. The growing tension between loyalty to Horus and loyalty to the Emperor created a complex emotional burden for Sanguinius, who found himself caught between his love for his brother and his duty to their father. The Angel's empathic abilities made it impossible for him to ignore the changes taking place within Horus, but his hope that these changes might be temporary or reversible prevented him from taking decisive action to address the growing threat. This internal conflict would continue to torment Sanguinius as the situation deteriorated, forcing him to confront the possibility that he might eventually be forced to choose between his personal relationships and his obligations to the Imperium. The first reports of Horus's rebellion reached Sanguinius through encrypted astropathic transmissions that arrived in fragments, their psychic carriers driven to madness by the sheer horror of what they had witnessed at Istvan III. The initial messages spoke of virus bombing and orbital bombardment, of loyal Astartes murdered by their own brothers in acts of betrayal so profound that the human mind struggled to process their implications. The Angel's prescient abilities had prepared him for this moment through years of increasingly vivid visions, yet the reality of his brother's fall still struck him with devastating force that left him physically staggered in his private chambers aboard the Red Tier. The confirmation came through official Imperial channels within hours, as the Sigillites' agents transmitted emergency orders that left no room for doubt about the magnitude of the crisis facing the Imperium. Horus Lupercal, once the most trusted of the Emperor's sons, had declared himself free from Imperial authority and was actively recruiting other Primarchs to his cause. The scale of the betrayal became apparent as intelligence reports identified the Iron Warriors, Night Lords, Alpha Legion, and Word-Bearers as confirmed traitors, while the loyalty of several other legions remained uncertain. The Great Crusade that had united humanity under the Emperor's banner was fracturing into the civil war that Sanguinius had seen in his darkest visions. The Blood Angel's response to the crisis was immediate and unequivocal. Within minutes of receiving confirmation of Horus's treachery, Sanguinius had summoned his senior officers to the stratageum of his flagship, where he formally reaffirmed the Legion's absolute loyalty to the Emperor and the throne of Terra. The assembled captains and chaplains received the news with shocked silence that gradually gave way to grim determination as they began to comprehend the implications of fighting their former brothers. The bonds of fellowship that had developed between the legions during the Great Crusade would now become sources of tactical intelligence and emotional vulnerability that both sides would seek to exploit. Captain Erasmus Tycho of the 3rd Company was among the first to speak after Sanguinius finished his briefing, his scarred features reflecting the same mixture of disbelief and rage that showed on the faces of his fellow officers. The captain's previous interactions with members of the Luna Wolves had been characterized by mutual respect and professional camaraderie, relationships that made the revelation of their betrayal particularly painful. His questions about the reliability of the intelligence reports reflected the desperate hope shared by many Blood Angels that some terrible mistake had been made, that their beloved War Master might yet prove innocent of the charges against him. The strategic situation facing the Loyalist forces became clearer as additional intelligence reached the Blood Angels' fleet through the emergency communication networks that the Sigillite had activated throughout Imperial space. The traitor legions had achieved tactical surprise through careful coordination and advanced planning that suggested months or even years of preparation for this moment. Key strategic positions throughout the galaxy had been seized or compromised, while Loyalist forces found themselves scattered and isolated, unable to coordinate effective responses to the rapidly developing crisis. The rebels' control of critical astropathic relay stations meant that reliable communication between Loyalist forces was becoming increasingly difficult. The isolation of the Blood Angels from the main Imperial forces resulted from their position in the Eastern Fringe, where they had been conducting compliance operations in systems far removed from the core Imperial territories. The Legion's current strength stood at approximately 80,000 Astartes distributed across multiple battle groups, a substantial force that could significantly impact the outcome of the Civil War if it could be brought to bear where needed most. However, the vast distances involved and the uncertain loyalty of various fleet elements meant that concentrating this strength would require careful planning and considerable risk. Sanguinius's first priority involved securing the loyalty of Imperial Army units and Navy vessels operating in the Eastern Fringe, many of which had received conflicting orders from various sources claiming legitimate authority. The Primarch's diplomatic skills proved crucial in these negotiations, as his reputation for honor and integrity provided a foundation of trust that allowed him to convince wavering commanders to maintain their allegiance to Terra rather than the War Master. These discussions often took place aboard the Red Tier itself, where the physical presence of the Angel and the obvious loyalty of his warriors helped reinforce the moral arguments for remaining faithful to the Emperor. The process of gathering intelligence about the extent of the rebellion required the Blood Angels to maintain contact with potentially hostile forces while avoiding premature engagement that might reveal their positions or intentions. Scout squadrons equipped with modified strike cruisers conducted reconnaissance missions throughout the surrounding sectors, gathering information about fleet movements and planetary allegiances while maintaining strict communication protocols to avoid detection. These operations revealed the disturbing extent to which the rebellion had spread, with entire sectors declaring for Horus, while others remained locked in internal conflicts that prevented them from supporting either side effectively. The journey toward Terra began with the consolidation of Loyalist forces scattered throughout the Eastern Fringe, a complex operation that required the Blood Angels to coordinate with Imperial Navy elements while avoiding contact with known traitor forces. The assembly point chosen by Sanguinius lay in the Cygnus system, a location that offered both strategic advantages and symbolic significance as the site of previous Blood Angels victories during the Great Crusade. The system's position along established warp routes would allow the combined fleet to reach Terra through multiple possible approaches, providing flexibility in route planning while minimizing the risk of interception by hostile forces. The fleet that assembled at Cygnus represented one of the largest concentrations of Loyalist strength outside the solar system itself, including not only the Blood Angels, but also substantial elements of the Imperial Army and Navy that had chosen to follow Sanguinius rather than risk capture or destruction by remaining in their original positions. The logistics of maintaining such a large force required careful coordination between the various supply ships and support vessels that accompanied the main battle fleet, creating a massive convoy that stretched across several million kilometers of space when traveling in formation. The warp storms that had been building throughout the galaxy since the beginning of the rebellion created unprecedented hazards for interstellar travel, forcing the Blood Angels' fleet to take increasingly circuitous routes to avoid the most dangerous areas of space-time distortion. These storms were not natural phenomena, but manifestations of the psychic turmoil created by the Civil War itself, as the collective anguish and rage of billions of humans fed the power of the Chaos Gods and strengthened their influence over the material universe. The fleet's navigators reported visions of terrible clarity while guiding their ships through the warp, glimpses of futures where humanity was consumed by eternal war and the galaxy burned in the fires of corruption. The first major obstacle encountered during the journey came in the form of a massive warp storm that blocked the most direct route to Terra, forcing the fleet to detour through systems that had not been fully explored during the Great Crusade. The alternative routes available to Sanguinius all carried significant risks, either from natural hazards or from the presence of potentially hostile forces that might have declared for Horus. The decision to proceed through the fall system represented a calculated gamble based on intelligence suggesting that the local Imperial forces remained loyal, though this information was several months old and its reliability uncertain. The passage through the fall system required the fleet to divide into smaller formations to avoid detection by long-range sensors, a tactical decision that reduced their defensive capabilities while increasing their vulnerability to surprise attack. Sanguinius personally led the advance elements aboard the Red Tier, using his prescient abilities to guide the fleet through the safest approaches, while maintaining communication with the trailing formations through carefully coordinated astropathic transmissions. The system's asteroid fields and radiation storms provided natural concealment for the fleet's movement, but also created additional hazards that claimed several escort vessels and damaged multiple larger ships. The challenges of maintaining fleet cohesion during the extended journey tested the Blood Angels' organizational capabilities in ways that peacetime operations had never required. The constant threat of warp storm activity meant that ships could become separated from the main fleet without warning, forcing individual captains to make independent decisions about whether to attempt rejoining the formation or proceeding directly to Terra. The Legion's command structure proved flexible enough to accommodate these contingencies, with pre-established protocols allowing separated elements to operate effectively while maintaining their overall strategic objectives. The coordination with other loyalist Primarchs became increasingly important as the scope of the rebellion became apparent, though communication difficulties made such coordination extremely challenging. Sanguinius established contact with Rogel Dorn of the Imperial Fists, who had been tasked with fortifying Terra against the coming assault, and with Leman Russ of the Space Wolves, whose legion was pursuing the fleeing Thousand Suns after the destruction of Prospero. These communications revealed the desperate nature of the Loyalist position, with forces scattered across the galaxy and unable to concentrate effectively against the coordinated traitor advance. The intelligence shared between Loyalist commanders painted a grim picture of the rebellion's progress, with Horus's forces advancing on multiple fronts, while Loyalist resistance remained fragmented and reactive. The traitor legions had demonstrated tactical innovation and strategic coordination that suggested extensive planning and preparation, advantages that would be difficult for the Loyalists to overcome through improvised responses. The psychological impact of fighting former brothers was also taking its toll on Loyalist forces, with reports of decreased morale and hesitation in combat that the traitors were exploiting ruthlessly. Sanguinius's role as a coordinator of Loyalist resistance emerged naturally from his reputation and relationships with his brother Primarchs, many of whom sought his counsel during the crisis. The angel's empathic abilities allowed him to provide emotional support to commanders struggling with the betrayal of trusted comrades, while his tactical expertise contributed to the development of strategies for countering the traitor's advantages. These responsibilities added to the burden already weighing on the Primarch, as he struggled to maintain his own legion's effectiveness while also serving the broader loyalist cause. The discovery of the Cygnus trap represented a crucial test of the Blood Angel's loyalty and resolve, as the apparent distress signal from the system proved to be an elaborate deception designed to lure loyalist forces into a carefully prepared ambush. The system had been corrupted by demonic influences that transformed its worlds into hellscapes populated by creatures that existed to destroy everything pure and noble in the universe. The Blood Angels' response to this trap would demonstrate both their tactical capabilities and their spiritual strength, as they faced enemies that sought to corrupt their souls as well as destroy their bodies. The fleet's approach to Cygnus revealed signs of massive orbital bombardment and surface devastation that initially suggested the system had been attacked by conventional forces, though closer examination revealed anomalies that defied rational explanation. Entire continents had been reshaped into blasphemous symbols that hurt to look upon, while the system's star itself flickered with unnatural colors that seemed to drain hope from those who observed them. The psychic emanations from the corrupted worlds caused physical pain among the fleet's astropaths and navigators, many of whom required sedation to prevent them from harming themselves in their anguish. The decision to enter the Cygnus system, despite these obvious dangers, reflected Sanguinius's understanding that the Blood Angels could not afford to ignore potential threats to their rear areas during the journey to Terra. The intelligence value of determining what had happened to the system's population outweighed the risks involved in investigation, particularly if the corruption could be contained before it spread to other imperial territories. The Primarch's prescient visions had shown him glimpses of the horrors awaiting his legion in the system, but also suggested that confronting these challenges would ultimately strengthen the Blood Angels for the trials ahead. The trap that awaited Sanguinius and the Blood Angels in the Cygnus cluster had been meticulously crafted by Horus himself, drawing upon his intimate knowledge of his brother's character and the unique vulnerabilities that the War Master had observed during their years of friendship. The false distress signal that had lured the Legion to this remote system spoke of Imperial forces under siege by Xeno's raiders, a scenario that would naturally appeal to Sanguinius's protective instincts and his sense of duty toward Imperial citizens in peril. The transmission itself bore all the authentication codes and linguistic patterns that would mark it as legitimate, having been constructed using intelligence gathered by traitor agents who had infiltrated Imperial communication networks months before the rebellion began. The corruption that had transformed the Cygnus system into a demon world exceeded anything the Blood Angels had previously encountered during their campaigns across the galaxy. The three primary worlds of the cluster, Cygnus Prime, Cygnus Secundus, and Cygnus Tertius, had been reshaped by warp energies that defied the fundamental laws of physics and reality. Mountain ranges twisted into impossible geometries that hurt to observe, while oceans of blood lapped against shores composed of crystallized screams. The very air itself carried a psychic weight that pressed against the minds of the approaching Astartes, whispering promises of power and threats of eternal torment in voices that seemed to emerge from within their own thoughts. The demonic presence that dominated the system revealed itself as Kabandha, a greater demon of Khorne whose hatred for the Blood Angels burned with the intensity of a collapsing star. This ancient entity had been bound to the service of the Blood God since before humanity had developed written language, its existence dedicated to the pursuit of skulls and the spilling of blood across countless battlefields throughout the galaxy. The demon's selection for this particular mission reflected Khorne's personal interest in corrupting or destroying Sanguinius, whose perfection and nobility represented everything that the Blood God despised about the Emperor's vision for humanity's future. The physical manifestation of Kabandha within the Cygnus system required massive expenditures of psychic energy that had been accumulated through ritual sacrifice and demonic possession across dozens of worlds. The greater demon's form towered above the corrupted landscape of Cygnus Prime, its brass armor reflecting the hellish light of the system's transformed star, while its massive wings cast shadows that seemed to drain hope from everything they touched. The demon's axe, forged in the blood god's own armories, crackled with energies that could cleave through ceramite and adamantium as easily as flesh and bone, while its whip writhed with a malevolent intelligence that sought to entangle and crush any opponent foolish enough to approach within striking distance. The Blood Angels' fleet entered the Cygnus system in standard battle formation, their sensors immediately detecting the massive psychic disturbance that emanated from the corrupted worlds. The Red Tier led the advance, its augur arrays struggling to process the contradictory readings that suggested the presence of both massive military forces and complete lifelessness across the system's inhabited zones. The fleet's navigators reported severe disorientation as they attempted to maintain their bearings within the system, the warp currents around Cygnus flowing in patterns that seemed designed to trap unwary vessels and prevent their escape back to normal space. Sanguinius felt the trap closing around his legion the moment their ships dropped out of the warp, his prescient abilities flooding his consciousness with visions of the horrors that awaited them on the system's corrupted worlds. The images that assaulted his mind showed blood angels falling to demonic corruption, their noble features twisted into bestial masks as they turned upon their battle brothers with fang and claw. Other visions revealed entire companies consumed by the red thirst, their discipline shattered as they descended into frenzied bloodbaths that served the interests of the very powers they had sworn to oppose. The Primarch's physical reaction to these prophetic glimpses was severe enough that his command staff became concerned for his well-being, though he managed to maintain his composure long enough to issue the initial deployment orders. The landing on Cygnus Prime proceeded despite the obvious dangers, as Sanguinius recognized that retreat would only delay the inevitable confrontation while potentially allowing the corruption to spread beyond the system's boundaries. The first wave of Blood Angels' Thunderhawks descended through an atmosphere that reeked of sulfur and decay, their pilots struggling to maintain control as demonic entities manifested around their aircraft in attempts to drag them into the warp. The landing zones selected by the Legion's tactical staff proved to be killing grounds, where the very soil sought to corrupt any pure thing that touched it, forcing the Blood Angels to establish their positions on platforms of blessed ceramite that had been consecrated by the Legion's chaplains. The initial reconnaissance of the primary world revealed the extent of the transformation that had befallen the Cygnus system's population. Cities that had once housed millions of imperial citizens now stood as monuments to corruption, their architecture warped into forms that served as focal points for demonic manifestation. The inhabitants themselves had been transformed into creatures that bore only passing resemblance to their original human forms, their bodies twisted by chaos mutations that reflected the particular aspects of corruption that had claimed them. Some had become living weapons whose flesh had hardened into bone and metal, while others existed as conduits for demonic possession that allowed warp entities to maintain permanent presence in the material universe. The Blood Angels' advance across Cygnus Prime met with resistance that escalated from harassment by lesser demons to coordinated assaults by corrupted human forces that retained enough tactical knowledge to pose serious threats to Astartes' formations. The enemy's strategy became apparent as the Legion pushed deeper into the world's interior, with each engagement designed to inflict maximum psychological damage while gradually wearing down the Blood Angels' spiritual defenses. The constant exposure to chaos corruption was taking its toll on the Legion's battle brothers, many of whom reported experiencing intrusive thoughts and violent impulses that seemed to emerge from outside their own consciousness. The manifestation of Kabandha occurred during the Blood Angels' assault on the primary hive city, where the greater demon materialized in a burst of brass light and sulfurous flame that incinerated everything within a kilometer radius of its arrival point. The demon's presence warped reality around it, causing gravity to fluctuate wildly, while the very air ignited in spontaneous fires that burned without consuming their fuel. The creature's roar shattered the windows of buildings dozens of kilometers away, while its psychic emanations drove several Blood Angels into immediate madness that required their battle brothers to restrain them to prevent self-harm. Sanguinius felt the demon's arrival like a physical blow to his soul, the creature's malevolent presence pressing against his consciousness with the weight of millennia of accumulated hatred and bloodshed. The Primarch's empathic abilities, normally a source of strength and understanding, became a liability as they forced him to experience the full extent of Cabenha's rage and the suffering it had inflicted across countless worlds. The psychic assault was so intense that Sanguinius briefly lost consciousness, his body collapsing to the corrupted ground as his mind struggled to process the overwhelming influx of alien emotion and memory. The greater demon's first words to the assembled blood angels carried the authority of Khorne himself, promising eternal glory to those who would abandon their loyalty to the Emperor and embrace the path of endless war and bloodshed. Cabenha spoke of the futility of their resistance, describing in vivid detail the fate that awaited Terra when Horus arrived with his traitor fleets. The demon's voice carried psychic weight that forced its words directly into the minds of its listeners, bypassing their conscious defenses to plant seeds of doubt and despair that would fester in the darkness of their thoughts. The initial engagement between the Blood Angels and the Greater Demon proved the inadequacy of conventional weapons against such a powerful entity. Bolter rounds and plasma blasts struck Cabenha's form without apparent effect, their energies absorbed or deflected by the demon's supernatural resilience. The creature's counterattacks devastated entire squads of Blood Angels, its axe cleaving through power armor and enhanced physiology with contemptuous ease, while its whip lashed out to crush Marines at ranges that should have been safe from melee combat. The psychological impact of watching their weapons prove useless against such an enemy began to erode the Legion's confidence in their ability to achieve victory through conventional means. Sanguinius recovered from the psychic assault in time to witness the slaughter of his sons, their deaths fueling his rage to levels that threatened to overwhelm his normally perfect self-control. The Primarch's fury manifested as a golden aura that surrounded his form, his psychic powers blazing like a miniature sun as he prepared to face the greater demon in single combat. The angel's wings spread to their full span as he launched himself skyward, the blade and carmine singing through the corrupted air as he closed the distance between himself and his monstrous opponent. The duel between Sanguinius and Cabenha became the focal point around which the entire battle revolved, their clash sending shockwaves through both the material and immaterial realms that were felt by psychers across multiple star systems. The Primarch's speed and aerial mobility allowed him to avoid the demon's most devastating attacks while delivering precise strikes that gradually wore down his opponent's defenses. The blade and carmine, blessed by the Emperor himself and forged with technologies that predated the Age of Strife, proved capable of inflicting real damage on the greater demon's supernatural form, each wound causing Cabenha to bellow in rage and pain. The turning point of the combat came when Sanguinius managed to entangle the demon's wings with his own, using his superior agility to force Cabenha into a grappling match where the creature's massive size became a disadvantage rather than an asset. The Primarch's enhanced strength, augmented by his righteous fury and psychic power, proved sufficient to match the demon's supernatural might as they struggled in midair above the corrupted battlefield. The sight of their Gene Father locked in mortal combat with such a terrible enemy inspired the Blood Angels to renewed efforts, their own attacks becoming more coordinated and effective as they drew strength from their Primarch's example. The climax of the duel occurred when Sanguinius succeeded in bringing Cabenha down to the ground, where the Primarch's tactical advantages could be fully utilized. The Angel's combat experience, honed through decades of warfare against every conceivable type of enemy, allowed him to anticipate and counter the demon's attacks while positioning himself for the decisive strike. The moment came when Cabenha overextended itself in a massive overhead swing, leaving its torso exposed for the split second that Sanguinius needed to close the distance and seize his opportunity. The breaking of Cabenha's back over Sanguinius's knee became one of the most legendary moments in the Blood Angels' history, a feat that demonstrated the Primarch's physical might while simultaneously striking a devastating blow against the forces of chaos. The The sound of the greater demon's spine snapping echoed across the battlefield like thunder, followed by a psychic scream that shattered the windows of buildings across the entire continent. The demon's form began to discorporate immediately, its connection to the material realm severed by the traumatic injury that would require centuries to heal even within the healing embrace of the warp. The defeat of Kabendha triggered a cascading collapse of the demonic forces throughout the Cygnus system, as lesser entities found themselves unable to maintain their manifestations without the greater demon's anchoring presence. The corrupted human forces that had served as the demon's mortal agents either fled in terror or turned upon each other in frenzied battles that served no tactical purpose beyond satisfying their need for violence and bloodshed. The psychic storms that had raged across the system's worlds began to dissipate, allowing the Blood Angels to establish secure communications with their orbital assets for the first time since entering the trap. The resistance displayed by the Blood Angels against the corruption of chaos during their ordeal in the Cygnus system demonstrated the strength of character that Sanguinius had instilled in his legion through years of careful training and indoctrination. Despite being exposed to temptations and pressures that had broken other Imperial forces, the vast majority of Blood Angels maintained their loyalty to the Emperor and their commitment to the ideals of the Great Crusade. The few battle brothers who did succumb to corruption were quickly identified and contained by their comrades, preventing the spread of taint that might have compromised entire companies. The psychological aftermath of the Cygnus campaign left lasting scars on the Blood Angels that would influence their behavior for millennia to come. The exposure to such concentrated chaos corruption had awakened dormant aspects of the Red Thirst that had previously remained manageable, creating new challenges for the Legion's command structure as they struggled to maintain discipline among warriors whose genetic predisposition toward violence had been stimulated by their experiences. The visions of corruption and betrayal that many Blood Angels had experienced during the campaign continued to haunt their dreams, creating a shared trauma that bonded the survivors together, while also serving as a constant reminder of their vulnerability to the powers of darkness. The escape from the Cygnus trap required careful coordination between the Legion's ground forces and their orbital assets, as the system's warp currents remained dangerously unstable despite the defeat of Kabendha. The Blood Angels fleet had to navigate through fields of psychic debris and reality storms that threatened to tear their ships apart or strand them permanently within the corrupted system. The successful extraction of the Legion's forces represented a triumph of skill and determination over impossible odds, though the cost in lives and equipment was substantial enough to significantly reduce the Blood Angels' combat effectiveness for the remainder of their journey to Terra. The intelligence gathered during the Cygnus campaign provided crucial insights into the methods and capabilities of Chaos forces that would prove invaluable during the later stages of the Horus Heresy. The Blood Angels' first-hand experience with demonic corruption and the psychological warfare tactics employed by the traitors gave them advantages in subsequent engagements that helped offset their numerical disadvantages. The lessons learned about maintaining spiritual purity in the face of overwhelming corruption were shared with other loyalist forces through encrypted communications, contributing to the development of countermeasures that helped prevent similar traps from achieving their intended effects. Sanguinius himself emerged from the Cygnus campaign fundamentally changed by his confrontation with the forces of chaos, his understanding of the true nature of the threat facing humanity deepened by direct experience with entities that existed solely to corrupt and destroy everything noble in the universe. The Primarch's prescient visions became more frequent and intense following his victory over Kabendha, as though his triumph had somehow enhanced his psychic sensitivity to the currents of fate that flowed around the galaxy. These visions continued to show him glimpses of his own death at the hands of Horus, images that filled him with sorrow for the brother he had once loved, while strengthening his resolve to prevent the War Master's ultimate victory. The prophetic visions that had plagued Sanguinius throughout his existence intensified dramatically following the Blood Angel's escape from the Cygnus trap, as though his confrontation with Kabendha had somehow torn away the veils that normally obscured the currents of fate flowing through the galaxy. The images that assaulted his consciousness during these episodes possessed a clarity and immediacy that made them indistinguishable from actual memories, forcing the Primarch to witness his own death with perfect detail across multiple potential timelines. In each vision, the setting remained constant, the bridge of Horus's flagship, the vengeful spirit, where the final confrontation between the Emperor and his fallen son would determine the fate of humanity itself. The consistency of these prophetic glimpses left no room for doubt about their authenticity, despite Sanguinius's desperate hope that they might represent mere possibilities rather than inevitable destiny. He saw himself standing between his father and Horus in those final moments, his golden wings spread wide as he made his last stand against the brother he had once loved above all others. The War Master's face in these visions bore the terrible marks of chaos corruption, his features twisted by powers that had consumed everything noble within him until only hatred and ambition remained. The moment of his death came with mechanical precision across every timeline, Horus's talons piercing his chest, his life's blood flowing across the deck plating as darkness claimed his vision. The psychological impact of witnessing his own demise repeatedly was compounded by the knowledge that these visions served a purpose beyond mere prophecy. Sanguinius understood that his prescient abilities were showing him these images not to torment him, but to prepare him for the choice he would ultimately face. The futures he observed invariably showed the Emperor arriving moments after his death, finding his son's broken form, and experiencing the rage that would finally give him the strength to destroy Horus completely. The angel's sacrifice would serve as the catalyst that broke through the War Master's remaining defenses, allowing their father to strike the killing blow that would end the rebellion. The burden of this knowledge weighed heavily on Sanguinius as the Blood Angel's fleet continued its journey toward Terra, the Primarch struggling to maintain his normal composure while grappling with the certainty of his approaching death. His empathic abilities, which had always allowed him to share the emotions of those around him, now seemed to isolate him further as he found himself unable to communicate the true nature of his burden to even his closest advisors. The knowledge that his death was necessary for the Emperor's ultimate victory made it impossible for him to seek comfort or counsel from others, as doing so might weaken his resolve when the crucial moment arrived. The first person to notice the change in their Primarch's demeanor was Chief Apothecary Miros, whose medical expertise and long service with the Legion had made him particularly attuned to subtle shifts in Sanguinius's physical and mental state. The apothecary observed that his Gene father's sleep patterns had become increasingly erratic, with periods of deep unconsciousness interrupted by violent awakenings that left the Primarch disoriented and exhausted. The medical scans that Miros conducted in secret revealed elevated stress hormones and unusual neural activity in regions of the brain associated with precognitive abilities, patterns that suggested the Primarch was experiencing psychic phenomena of unprecedented intensity. Miros's attempts to discuss these observations with Sanguinius were met with gentle but firm deflection, the Primarch acknowledging his advisor's concerns while refusing to elaborate on the specific nature of his experiences. The conversation that followed revealed the depth of Sanguinius's internal struggle, as he admitted to experiencing visions of the future while carefully avoiding any details that might compromise his ability to fulfill his destined role. The apothecary's loyalty to his Primarch prevented him from pressing the matter further, though his medical instincts warned him that the psychological strain was approaching dangerous levels. The decision to share selected aspects of his visions with his senior command staff came after weeks of internal debate, as Sanguinius weighed the need for operational preparation against the risk of demoralizing his officers. The briefing he conducted in the Red Tier Strategium was carefully structured to convey the essential information without revealing the full scope of what he had seen. He spoke of visions showing a final confrontation aboard the Vengeful Spirit, where the fate of the Imperium would be decided through single combat between the Emperor and Horus. His own role in these events was described in vague terms that emphasized the importance of ensuring the Blood Angel's survival beyond his potential death. Captain Raldoron of the First Company was the first to grasp the implications of his Primarch's words, his tactical experience allowing him to read between the lines of the carefully chosen phrases. The captain's questions about contingency planning and succession protocols revealed his understanding that Sanguinius was preparing for the possibility of his own death, though the Primarch's responses remained deliberately ambiguous. The other officers present gradually came to similar conclusions, their growing unease evident in their posture and expressions as they began to comprehend the gravity of what their Gene Father was telling them. The establishment of new operational protocols began immediately following this briefing, as Sanguinius worked to ensure that the Blood Angels would remain an effective fighting force even after the loss of their Primarch. The command structure was modified to provide greater autonomy to individual captains, while communication procedures were updated to allow for rapid decision-making in situations where centralized command might be compromised. These changes were presented as standard wartime adaptations, though the senior officers understood their true purpose was to prepare the Legion for leadership transition under the most difficult possible circumstances. The selection of potential successors required delicate handling, as Sanguinius could not openly designate a replacement without confirming his expectation of death. Instead, he began assigning increased responsibilities to officers he considered most capable of maintaining the Legion's unity and effectiveness, gradually shifting administrative duties to create an informal hierarchy that would naturally assume command if necessary. Captain Raldoron emerged as the primary beneficiary of this process, his combination of tactical skill and unwavering loyalty making him the obvious choice to lead the Blood Angels through the dark times ahead. The conversations with trusted advisors about the Legion's future took on increasing urgency as the fleet drew closer to Terra, with Sanguinius using these discussions to reinforce the principles and values that he wanted his sons to maintain after his death. The importance of loyalty to the Emperor and the Imperium was emphasized repeatedly, along with the need to resist the corrupting influence of chaos that would undoubtedly intensify as the Civil War progressed. The Primarch's artistic sensibilities, which had always been central to the Legion's identity, were presented as essential tools for maintaining their humanity in the face of the horrors they would encounter. The establishment of the Sanguinary Guard as an elite formation within the Legion served multiple purposes beyond their obvious role as the Primarch's personal bodyguards. These warriors, selected from the most exemplary members of the First Company, were trained not only in combat techniques, but also in the traditions and history of the Blood Angels that they would be expected to preserve and transmit to future generations. Their golden armor and ceremonial weapons marked them as living symbols of the Legion's values, while their close proximity to Sanguinius allowed them to observe and learn from his leadership methods firsthand. The psychological preparation of the Sanguinary Guard for their ultimate failure was perhaps the most difficult aspect of Sanguinius's planning, as he needed to ensure their effectiveness as bodyguards while also preparing them for the possibility that they would be unable to prevent his death. The training exercises conducted aboard the Red Tier included scenarios where the Guard was required to continue fighting after the simulated loss of their Primarch, emphasizing the importance of completing the mission even in the face of personal tragedy. These drills were presented as standard tactical preparation, though their true purpose was to condition the warriors for the psychological trauma they would experience when their protection failed. The modification of Legion recruitment and training procedures reflected Sanguinius's concern for the long-term stability of the Blood Angels in the face of the genetic flaws that continued to plague their gene seed. The screening processes developed by Chief Apothecary Miros were refined further to identify candidates with the greatest resistance to the Red Thirst, while new psychological conditioning techniques were implemented to strengthen the mental defenses of prospective Marines. These improvements were presented as enhancements to existing protocols rather than responses to specific problems, maintaining the secrecy that surrounded the Legion's genetic issues. The documentation of the Legion's history and traditions became a priority during the journey to Terra, as Sanguinius recognized that the knowledge accumulated over decades of service might be lost if not properly preserved. The fortress monastery's archives were expanded to include detailed records of tactical innovations, artistic achievements, and cultural practices that define the Blood Angels' identity. These records were duplicated and distributed throughout the fleet to ensure their survival, even if the primary archives were destroyed during the coming battles. The creation of new rituals and ceremonies designed to honor fallen heroes reflected Sanguinius's understanding that the Blood Angels would face unprecedented losses during the Siege of Terra. The rites of remembrance that he established provided frameworks for commemorating the dead while maintaining the morale and fighting spirit of the survivors. These ceremonies incorporated elements from the tribal traditions of Baal alongside imperial military customs, creating hybrid practices that acknowledged both the Legion's origins and their current identity as servants of the Emperor. The strategic planning for the defense of Terra required Sanguinius to balance his knowledge of future events with the need to maintain operational security and avoid actions that might inadvertently alter the timeline he had witnessed. The defensive positions and tactical deployments he recommended were based on his prescient visions of the siege, though he was careful to present his suggestions as logical responses to the strategic situation rather than prophetic insights. The other loyalist commanders accepted his recommendations based on his reputation for tactical excellence, unaware that their colleague was drawing upon knowledge of battles yet to be fought. The coordination with Rogel Dorn and the Imperial Fists presented particular challenges, as Sanguinius needed to prepare his brother for the possibility of assuming overall command of the defense without revealing the specific circumstances that would make such a transition necessary. The discussions between the two Primarchs focused on contingency planning and resource allocation, with Sanguinius gradually shifting responsibilities to Dorn's organization while maintaining the appearance of normal operational coordination. The Imperial Fist's expertise in defensive warfare made them natural partners for the Blood Angels, whose aerial mobility would be crucial for responding to breakthrough attempts by the traitor forces. The final preparations conducted aboard the Red Tier as the fleet approached the solar system reflected the accumulated weight of Sanguinius's prophetic burden and his determination to ensure that his death would serve its intended purpose. The Primarch's personal effects were quietly distributed among his officers, while his private chambers were cleared of items that might compromise Legion security if they fell into enemy hands. The Blade and Carmine was subjected to additional consecration rituals that would enhance its effectiveness against chaos-corrupted opponents, while his armor was modified to include emergency beacon systems that would allow his body to be recovered even from the most dangerous battlefield conditions. The psychological state of the Legion as they prepared for the siege reflected their Primarch's own internal struggles, though the rank and file Marines remained unaware of the specific nature of the burden their Gene father carried. The veterans who had served longest with Sanguinius detected subtle changes in his demeanor that suggested he was preparing for something momentous, while the newer recruits simply accepted their commander's increased intensity as a natural response to the approaching battle. The overall morale of the Blood Angels remained high despite the challenges they had faced, their confidence in their Primarch's leadership unshaken by the trials that lay ahead. The arrival of the Blood Angels' fleet at the edge of the solar system came at the darkest hour of the siege, when Horus's armadas had already broken through the outer system defenses and established orbital supremacy around humanity's birthworld. The sight that greeted Sanguinius as his ships emerged from the warp filled even his noble heart with despair. Vast formations of traitor vessels surrounded Terra like a malevolent constellation, their gun batteries maintaining constant bombardment of the planetary defense networks, while landing craft ferried endless streams of enemy forces to the surface below. The skies above Terra burned with the reflected light of orbital fire, while the planet's once pristine continents bore the scars of months of sustained assault. The Red Tier led the Blood Angels through the outer reaches of the system, using asteroid fields and debris clouds to mask their approach, while Sanguinius assessed the tactical situation through long-range augur readings. The scale of the traitor fleet exceeded even his worst expectations, with elements from 8 separate legions visible among the assembled armadas, alongside countless Imperial army units that had declared for the War Master. The coordination displayed by these forces demonstrated the effectiveness of Horus's command structure, as supply convoys moved with clockwork precision between the various fleet elements, while combat air patrols maintained overlapping coverage patterns that would make any direct assault prohibitively costly. The breakthrough to Terra's surface required the Blood Angels to exploit a narrow window of opportunity created by the Loyalist fleet's diversionary attacks against the traitor orbital positions. Sanguinius coordinated his approach with Admiral Krensky of the Solar Defense Fleet, timing his descent to coincide with a major assault on the enemy's port flank that would draw their attention away from the planet's northern hemisphere. The Blood Angels' Thunderhawks and Storm Eagles launched from their carriers while still in the upper atmosphere, their pilots pushing their aircraft to maximum performance as they dove through the traitor air patrols in a desperate race to reach the Imperial Palace before enemy interceptors could respond effectively. The flight to the palace took the Blood Angels across a landscape transformed by months of warfare into something barely recognizable as humanity's ancient homeworld. The great hive cities that had once stretched toward the sky lay in ruins, their populations either dead or fled to the underground shelters that honeycombed the planet's crust. Vast craters marked the sites where orbital bombardments had penetrated the void shields, while the twisted remains of defense installations bore witness to the ferocity of the ground assault. The very air tasted of smoke and death, while the horizon flickered with the constant flash of artillery exchanges and plasma discharges. The Imperial Palace itself stood as a beacon of defiance amid the devastation, its ancient walls and towering spires somehow maintaining their structural integrity despite the concentrated firepower that had been directed against them for months. The fortress monastery that the Emperor had built to serve as the seat of his galactic empire had been transformed into the ultimate defensive position, with every approach covered by overlapping fields of fire and every weak point reinforced with additional armor and weapon emplacements. The golden eagles that adorned the palace's highest towers still caught the light of Terra's sun, their wings spread in eternal vigilance over the birthplace of human civilization. Sanguinius felt a surge of fierce pride as his aircraft approached the palace's landing platforms, the sight of the Aquila banners still flying from the battlements, confirming that the defenders had maintained their positions despite everything the traitors could throw at them. The coordination required to guide hundreds of aircraft through the palace's defensive perimeter while avoiding friendly fire incidents tested the skills of both the Blood Angels pilots and the Imperial Fist's gunners who manned the anti-aircraft batteries. The successful completion of this maneuver without significant losses demonstrated the professionalism that still characterized the Loyalist forces despite months of grinding warfare. The reunion with Rogel Dorn took place in the palace's primary command center, a vast chamber buried deep within the fortress's foundations, where banks of cogitator terminals displayed tactical information from across the entire battlefield. The Imperial Fist's Primarch's appearance shocked Sanguinius, as his normally immaculate brother showed clear signs of the strain imposed by months of constant combat and responsibility. Dorn's armor bore the scars of countless engagements, while his face reflected the exhaustion of a commander who had not rested properly since the siege began. Despite his obvious fatigue, the Praetorian's tactical acumen remained as sharp as ever, his briefing covering every aspect of the defensive situation with characteristic thoroughness and precision. The strategic situation that Dorn outlined was grimmer than even Sanguinius's visions had suggested, with traitor forces having achieved significant penetrations of the palace's outer defenses through sustained assault and infiltration operations. The enemy's superior numbers were beginning to tell despite the defensive advantages enjoyed by the Loyalists, while ammunition and medical supplies were running dangerously low after months of sustained combat. The arrival of the Blood Angels provided a crucial reinforcement at the moment when the defenders' strength was approaching its breaking point, though even their addition would only delay the inevitable, unless the siege could be broken through some decisive action. The assignment of defensive sectors reflected both the Blood Angels' capabilities and the critical nature of their positions within the overall defensive scheme. Sanguinius accepted responsibility for the Eternity Gate, the massive portal that provided the primary access route to the palace's inner sanctum, where the Emperor maintained his vigil over the Golden Throne. The symbolism of this assignment was not lost on either Primarch, as the defense of this position would require the Blood Angels to serve as the final barrier between the traitors and their ultimate objective. The tactical challenges involved in holding such a position against overwhelming odds would test every aspect of the Legion's training and equipment. The Eternity Gate itself stood as one of the architectural marvels of the Imperial Palace, a massive adamantium portal flanked by towering statues of the Emperor's greatest champions from the Unification Wars. The gate's defensive systems incorporated the finest military technology available to the Imperium, with void shield generators, automated weapon systems, and sensory arrays that could detect approaching enemies from kilometers away. The approaches to the gate had been carefully designed to channel attacking forces into predetermined killing zones, where the defenders could bring maximum firepower to bear, while minimizing their own exposure to enemy return fire. The Blood Angels' deployment around the Eternity Gate followed tactical doctrines that Sanguinius had developed specifically for this type of defensive operation, with jump pack-equipped assault squads positioned to provide rapid response to breakthrough attempts, while heavy weapons teams established overlapping fields of fire across all possible approach routes. The Legion's chaplains moved among the defensive positions, conducting blessing rituals and providing spiritual guidance to warriors who understood they were likely fighting their final battle. The integration of these forces with existing Imperial Fists positions required careful coordination to ensure that the combined defensive fire would achieve maximum effectiveness without creating gaps that enemy infiltrators might exploit. The first major assault against the Eternity Gate came within hours of the Blood Angels' arrival, as traitor reconnaissance forces probed the new defensive arrangements to identify weaknesses that could be exploited in subsequent attacks. The enemy's approach demonstrated the tactical sophistication that characterized Horus's forces, with diversionary attacks drawing attention away from the primary thrust, while specialized infiltration teams attempted to penetrate the defenders' perimeter through underground tunnels and maintenance shafts. The Blood Angels' response showcased their aerial mobility advantages, as jump pack squads could rapidly redeploy to counter threats that might have overwhelmed static defensive positions. The intensity of combat around the gate escalated rapidly as both sides committed increasing resources to what they recognized as a crucial engagement point. Traitor artillery batteries established firing positions in the ruins of nearby administrative districts, their shells falling in constant barrages that tested the void shields protecting the gate complex. The defenders responded with counter-battery fire from concealed positions within the palace walls, creating a deadly game of cat and mouse as both sides attempted to locate and eliminate enemy gun positions while protecting their own assets from retaliation. Sanguinius established his command post in one of the gate towers, where he could maintain visual contact with the battlefield while coordinating defensive operations across the entire sector. The Primarch's prescient abilities proved invaluable in anticipating enemy attack patterns, allowing him to position his forces to maximum advantage before each assault began. His presence on the front lines provided inspiration to the defenders while also allowing him to make real-time tactical adjustments based on changing battlefield conditions. The sight of their Gene Father fighting alongside them gave the Blood Angels the courage to hold positions that lesser warriors would have abandoned in the face of overwhelming odds. The coordination with Imperial Fists and White Scar's elements created a combined defensive force that maximized the strengths of each legion while compensating for their individual limitations. The Imperial Fist's expertise in static defense provided the foundation upon which the more mobile Blood Angels and White Scar's units could operate, while their combined firepower created killing zones that channeled enemy attacks into predetermined areas where they could be defeated in detail. The communication systems that linked these units allowed for rapid coordination of defensive fires and mutual support operations that multiplied the effectiveness of each individual squad. The breakthrough attempts that followed demonstrated the full extent of traitor capabilities, as Horus committed elite units from multiple legions to simultaneous assaults designed to overwhelm the defenders through sheer weight of numbers and firepower. The Sons of Horus led these attacks with their characteristic aggression and tactical flexibility, while World Eaters provided shock assault troops whose berserker fury made them nearly unstoppable in close combat. Iron Warriors siege specialists brought heavy weapons and demolition charges that could breach even the palace's formidable defenses, while Night Lord's infiltration teams attempted to sow confusion and terror behind the loyalist lines. The defense of the gate required every tactical innovation that Sanguinius could devise, as conventional defensive doctrines proved inadequate against enemies who possessed intimate knowledge of imperial military capabilities and tactics. The Primarch's artistic sensibilities proved unexpectedly valuable in this context, as his understanding of aesthetic principles allowed him to recognize patterns in enemy attack formations that purely military analysis might have missed. These insights enabled him to predict enemy movements and position his forces to maximum advantage, turning what should have been overwhelming assaults into manageable engagements where superior positioning compensated for numerical disadvantage. The psychological warfare employed by both sides added another dimension to the conflict, as traitor forces attempted to demoralize the defenders through displays of captured loyalist equipment and the broadcast of surrender demands from corrupted imperial officers. The Blood Angels' response to these tactics reflected their Primarch's influence, maintaining their focus on duty and honor while refusing to be drawn into the emotional manipulation that the enemy was attempting. The Legion's chaplains played a crucial role in maintaining morale, conducting field services, and providing spiritual guidance that helped the warriors resist the insidious influence of chaos corruption. The supply situation became increasingly critical as the siege progressed, with ammunition expenditure far exceeding the rates that Imperial logistics had planned for during the palace's construction. The Blood Angels adapted to these constraints by modifying their tactical approaches to emphasize precision over volume of fire, with individual Marines required to make every shot count rather than relying on suppressive fire to achieve their objectives. The Legion's technical specialists worked around the clock to maintain weapons and equipment that were being pushed far beyond their normal operational parameters, while medical personnel treated casualties with limited supplies and inadequate facilities. The integration of civilian volunteers into the defensive effort reflected the desperate nature of the situation, as palace staff and administrative personnel were pressed into service as ammunition carriers, medical assistants, and communication runners. These individuals, many of whom had never experienced combat before the siege began, displayed remarkable courage and dedication in supporting the professional military forces. Their contribution proved invaluable in maintaining the complex logistics required to sustain defensive operations across such an extended front, while their presence served as a constant reminder of what the defenders were fighting to protect. The enemy's escalation to demon-assisted assaults marked a new phase in the battle for the Eternity Gate, as Chaos forces began deploying supernatural entities that conventional weapons could not effectively engage. These creatures materialized within the defensive perimeter through warp rifts that bypassed physical barriers, creating chaos and confusion that the traitor forces attempted to exploit through coordinated ground assaults. The Blood Angels' experience during the Cygnus campaign proved crucial in developing countermeasures against these supernatural threats, as their previous exposure to demonic corruption had taught them techniques for maintaining spiritual purity under the most extreme circumstances. The final phase of the siege approached as intelligence reports confirmed that Horus himself was preparing to teleport aboard his flagship for the ultimate confrontation with the Emperor. Sanguinius felt the weight of destiny settling upon him as his prescient visions became more frequent and detailed, showing him with perfect clarity the events that would unfold aboard the vengeful spirit. The knowledge that his death was approaching filled him not with fear, but with a profound sadness for the brother he had once loved, and the future that might have been if chaos had never corrupted the War Master's noble heart. The moment that would define the fate of humanity arrived when the Emperor's psychic beacon aboard the vengeful spirit penetrated the warp storm surrounding Terra, its signal cutting through the chaotic interference that had prevented teleportation for months. Horus had deliberately lowered the flagship's void shields in what appeared to be an act of supreme confidence, though Sanguinius recognized it as the trap it truly was, a final gambit designed to lure the Emperor into personal combat, where the War Master believed his chaos-enhanced abilities would prove decisive. The psychic emanations from the massive battleship carried undertones of corruption so profound that even non-psychers could sense the malevolent presence that had transformed the once noble vessel into a floating temple of the dark gods. Sanguinius felt the familiar weight of destiny as he joined the Emperor and Rogel Dorn in the palace's teleportarium chamber, the ancient machinery humming with barely contained energies as the tech adepts made final preparations for the most crucial transport operation in human history. The Emperor's presence filled the chamber with golden light that seemed to push back the shadows cast by the overhead lumens, his psychic might creating an aura of absolute authority that made even the Primarchs feel small in comparison. The Master of Mankind's features remained impassive as he reviewed the tactical data one final time, though Sanguinius could sense the profound sorrow that filled his father's heart at the necessity of what was to come. The teleportation itself felt different from any transport Sanguinius had previously experienced. The warp currents around the vengeful spirit, twisted by chaos influence into patterns that seemed designed to scatter or corrupt any Imperial forces attempting to board the vessel. The sensation of dissolution and reconstruction lasted longer than normal, with moments of terrifying clarity where the angel could perceive the raw stuff of the warp pressing against his consciousness, like acid against bare skin. The protective wards inscribed into his armor flared with golden fire as they repelled the worst of the corruption, while his own psychic defenses strained to maintain coherence against forces that sought to unmake his very existence. The materialization aboard the vengeful spirit revealed the full extent of the flagship's transformation under chaos influence. Its corridors and chambers warped into configurations that hurt to observe directly. The walls themselves seemed to pulse with malevolent life, their surfaces decorated with symbols that shifted and changed when viewed peripherally, while the air carried the metallic taste of spilled blood mixed with the sulfurous stench of demon manifestation. The ship's internal architecture had been redesigned according to principles that owed nothing to human engineering, with passages that led in impossible directions and chambers that existed in spaces larger than their external dimensions should have allowed. The separation that occurred during the transport process was no accident, but a deliberate manipulation of the teleportation coordinates designed to isolate each member of the boarding party in different sections of the massive vessel. Sanguinius found himself alone in what had once been the ship's primary stratagem, though the chamber now bore no resemblance to its original purpose. The tactical displays had been replaced with viewing portals that showed scenes of torture and corruption from across the galaxy, while the command throne had been transformed into a blasphemous altar stained with the blood of countless sacrifices. The very air seemed to whisper with the voices of the damned, their pleas for mercy mixing with promises of power that sought to burrow into his consciousness. The journey through the ship's corrupted passages required constant vigilance against both physical and spiritual threats, as demon entities materialized from the shadows to test the angel's resolve with temptations tailored specifically to his nature. These creatures spoke with voices like silver bells, offering him visions of a galaxy where his sons would never again suffer from the red thirst, where the blood angels could achieve the perfection that had always eluded them. The promises were seductive precisely because they addressed his deepest fears and desires, but Sanguinius recognized them as the lies they were, his faith in the Emperor providing an unshakable foundation against such corruption. The blade in carmine sang with harmonics that seemed to resonate with the ship's twisted structure, as Sanguinius carved his way through the manifestations that sought to bar his progress. Each strike of the ancient weapon released bursts of golden energy that caused the corrupted metal around him to recoil as though burned, while the runes inscribed along its length blazed with light that drove back the shadows pressing in from all sides. The sword had been blessed by the Emperor himself during the early days of the Great Crusade, its molecular structure infused with psychic energies that made it anathema to the forces of chaos. The Bridge of the Vengeful Spirit had been transformed into a throne room worthy of the dark gods themselves, its soaring ceiling lost in shadows that seemed to move with independent purpose, while braziers filled with unholy flames provided flickering illumination that cast dancing shadows across surfaces decorated with the flayed skins of loyalist space marines. The command throne where Horus had once coordinated the Luna Wolves' greatest victories now stood as a monument to corruption, its adamantium frame twisted into the shape of a screaming face, while cables and tubes fed directly into the occupants' armor systems. The air itself seemed thick with malevolence, each breath carrying the taste of decay and the whispered promises of powers beyond mortal comprehension. Horus Lupercal bore no resemblance to the brother Sanguinius had once loved, his noble features twisted by chaos corruption into something that was no longer entirely human. The Warmaster's armor had fused with his flesh in places, creating a hybrid of ceramite and mutated tissue that pulsed with its own internal rhythms, while his eyes burned with fires that reflected the influence of all four chaos gods simultaneously. The talon weapons that extended from his gauntlets dripped with energies that could wound the soul as well as the body, their edges sharp enough to cut through reality itself and allow the raw stuff of the warp to bleed into the material universe. The confrontation between the two Primarchs began not with violence but with words, as Horus attempted one final time to corrupt his brother through appeals to their shared history and the bonds of brotherhood that had once united them. The Warmaster spoke of the Emperor's betrayal of his sons, describing in vivid detail the way their father had abandoned the Great Crusade to pursue mysterious projects on Terra, while leaving his children to bear the burden of galactic conquest alone. The arguments were sophisticated and carefully crafted, drawing upon genuine grievances and legitimate concerns that Horus had nurtured during his fall to chaos. Sanguinius listened to his brother's words with growing sorrow, recognizing the kernel of truth that lay at the heart of each accusation, while understanding how that truth had been twisted by chaos influence into something monstrous. The angel could see the pain that still existed within Horus's corrupted psyche, the genuine hurt and sense of abandonment that the dark gods had exploited to turn the greatest of the Primarchs against his father and brothers. The tragedy of the situation was not lost on Sanguinius, who understood that under different circumstances, Horus's concerns might have been addressed through discussion and compromise rather than civil war and corruption. The refusal that Sanguinius offered was delivered with the same gentle firmness that had characterized all his interactions with those who sought to turn him from his chosen path. He spoke of duty and loyalty not as abstract concepts, but as fundamental aspects of his identity, explaining that his love for Horus could not override his obligations to the Emperor and the Imperium that they had all sworn to serve. The angel's words carried no condemnation or anger, only a profound sadness for what his brother had become and what their relationship had been reduced to through the machinations of powers that cared nothing for the bonds between mortals. The transformation of Horus's expression from hope to rage marked the end of any possibility for peaceful resolution, as the Warmaster's features contorted into a mask of fury that reflected the full extent of his corruption. The psychic emanations that surrounded him intensified to the point where the air itself began to burn, while his voice took on harmonics that seemed to come from multiple throats simultaneously. The brother who had once inspired loyalty through charisma and noble example was gone, replaced by something that existed only to destroy everything pure and beautiful in the universe. The duel that followed tested every aspect of Sanguinius's combat training and supernatural abilities, as Horus's chaos-enhanced strength and speed pushed the angel to the very limits of his capabilities. The Warmaster's fighting style had evolved beyond anything recognizably human, incorporating movements and techniques that drew upon demonic influence to achieve effects that should have been impossible within the constraints of physical reality. His talon strikes could phase through solid matter to strike directly at his opponent's soul, while his psychic attacks sought to shatter Sanguinius's sanity through exposure to truths too terrible for mortal minds to process. The angel's response combined his natural aerial mobility with combat techniques refined through decades of warfare against every conceivable type of opponent. His wings allowed him to attack from angles that ground-bound fighters could not defend against, while his prescient abilities provided split-second warnings of incoming attacks that would otherwise have been impossible to avoid. The blade in Carmine moved in patterns that seemed to follow mathematical principles rather than mere combat doctrine, each strike calculated to exploit momentary weaknesses in Horus's defense, while positioning Sanguinius for follow-up attacks that built upon previous damage. The battle raged across the entire bridge, as both combatants utilized their superhuman abilities to their fullest extent, their movements so fast that normal human eyes would have been unable to track them. Horus's raw power advantage was offset by Sanguinius's superior technique and tactical awareness, while the angel's nobility of spirit provided protection against the psychological attacks that the War Master employed alongside his physical assaults. The sound of their weapons meeting rang like thunder through the corrupted chamber, each impact sending shockwaves through the ship's structure that caused bulkheads to crack and support beams to groan under the stress. The final moments of the duel unfolded exactly as Sanguinius had seen in his prophetic visions. The War Master's face showed no trace of the brother he had once been as he delivered the killing blow, his features twisted into an expression of savage satisfaction that reflected the influence of the dark gods rather than any human emotion. The corruption that flowed from his weapons into Sanguinius's body was designed not merely to kill, but to claim his soul for chaos, seeking to transform the purest of the Primarchs into a demon prince in service to the very powers he had spent his life opposing. The psychic scream that accompanied Sanguinius's death echoed across both the material and immaterial realms, its intensity so profound that every blood angel throughout the galaxy felt their gene fathers passing like a physical blow to their souls. The empathic bond that had connected the Primarch to his sons since their creation transmitted not only the fact of his death, but also the emotional context surrounding it, the betrayal, the corruption, and the terrible necessity that had driven him to sacrifice himself for the greater good. This psychic trauma would scar the Legion's collective consciousness permanently, creating the foundation for the black rage that would plague future generations of Blood Angels. The Emperor's arrival on the bridge occurred moments after Sanguinius's death, his psychic presence blazing like a star as he discovered his son's broken form lying at the base of Horus's throne. The Master of Mankind's reaction to this sight transcended mere grief or anger, becoming something that existed beyond normal human emotion and entered the realm of cosmic forces. The restraint that had characterized his previous encounters with Horus evaporated completely, replaced by a divine wrath that sought nothing less than the complete annihilation of the traitor who had dared to murder his most beloved son. The final confrontation between the Emperor and Horus was brief but apocalyptic in its intensity, as the Master of Mankind unleashed psychic energies that had been held in check throughout the entire heresy. The death of Sanguinius had provided the emotional catalyst necessary to break through the last vestiges of paternal love that had prevented the Emperor from destroying his fallen son completely, allowing him to strike with the full force of his divine nature. The psychic blast that finally ended Horus's existence was so powerful that it not only destroyed his physical form, but also obliterated his soul completely, ensuring that no trace of the War Master would survive to be resurrected by the Dark Gods. The legacy of Sanguinius's sacrifice extended far beyond the immediate tactical victory it had enabled, becoming the foundation upon which the Blood Angels would build their identity for the next 10 millennia. The black rage that emerged from the psychic trauma of witnessing their Primarch's death would transform randomly selected members of the Legion into living embodiments of their Gene Father's final battle, driven by visions so vivid that they believed themselves to be Sanguinius himself facing Horus aboard the Vengeful Spirit. These afflicted warriors would be formed into death companies, their inevitable fate accepted as a continuation of their Primarch's sacrifice rather than a curse to be overcome. The transformation of Sanguinius into a figure of veneration throughout the Imperium reflected the profound impact that his sacrifice had upon human consciousness during the dark days following the heresy. His image became synonymous with noble self-sacrifice and unwavering loyalty to the Emperor, inspiring countless generations of imperial citizens to maintain their faith even in the face of overwhelming adversity. The artistic representations of the angel that adorned cathedrals and shrines across the galaxy served not merely as decorative elements, but as focal points for prayers and meditation that helped sustain human civilization through its darkest hours. The blood angels themselves became living monuments to their Primarch's memory, their every action guided by the example he had set during his brief but glorious existence. The artistic traditions that Sanguinius had fostered within the Legion evolved into elaborate rituals of remembrance that preserved not only his tactical innovations, but also his philosophical teachings about the relationship between beauty and duty. The fortress monastery on Baal was transformed into a shrine that attracted pilgrims from across the galaxy, its halls filled with works of art that captured different aspects of the angel's life and sacrifice. The genetic legacy that Sanguinius had bequeathed to his sons carried both blessing and curse in equal measure, as the same enhanced physiology that made them superior warriors also predisposed them to the spiritual afflictions that would define their character. The red thirst that had plagued the Legion since its founding became intertwined with the Black Rage, in ways that the Legion's apothecaries struggled to understand, creating a complex web of genetic and psychic influences that shaped every aspect of Blood Angel's culture. The management of these conditions became a sacred duty that required the combined efforts of chaplains, apothecaries, and librarians working in concert to maintain the Legion's fighting effectiveness while honoring their Primarch's memory. The tactical doctrines that emerged from the Blood Angel's experiences during the Horus Heresy incorporated lessons learned not only from their victories, but also from their Primarch's ultimate sacrifice, emphasizing the importance of accepting death in service to the greater good rather than seeking personal glory or survival. The aerial assault techniques that had been refined under Sanguinius's guidance became the foundation for specialized formations that could achieve tactical objectives impossible for conventional ground forces, while the Legion's emphasis on individual excellence ensured that each warrior could function effectively even when separated from larger formations. The influence of Sanguinius's example extended beyond his own Legion to inspire other imperial forces throughout the millennia that followed, as his story became one of the foundational myths that sustained human civilization during its ongoing struggle against the forces of chaos. The angel's refusal to compromise his principles, even when faced with corruption and death, provided a template for resistance that countless imperial servants would follow when confronted with their own moments of testing. His memory became a source of strength that transcended the limitations of mere historical record, achieving a mythic status that made him as relevant to the 41st millennium as he had been to the 31st. The final testament of Sanguinius lay not in any written document or recorded speech, but in the living legacy of the Blood Angels themselves and the countless acts of heroism they would perform in his name throughout the long darkness that followed his death. The great angel's sacrifice had purchased not merely the Emperor's victory over Horus, but the survival of human civilization itself, ensuring that the light of the Imperium would continue to burn even in the face of 10,000 years of war and suffering. His wings, forever stilled by death, had carried humanity itself to safety on the currents of his noble example, making him truly the most beloved of the Emperor's sons and the eternal guardian of mankind's future.